At a banquet, my husband Stephen and my in-laws were ignoring me for some reason. The rest of the relatives reacted the same way. Feeling suspicious, I pretended to go to the restroom and secretly observed everyone from behind a cover. Then, I overheard a horrifying conversation. A barren daughter-in-law is an ominous presence itself. That's right, talking to such ominous people might curse us too. It's better not to deal with her. Hearing these words, I was so angry that my body started shaking. It was unforgivable to be blamed for infertility and moreover to be ignored as if I didn't exist. It seemed there was no choice but to carry out my plan right away. After slipping away from the venue secretly, my phone vibrated. It was Stephen on the call. "Hey, what have you done?" Stephen yelled in agony. I chuckled. "What are you panicking for? It's the truth, isn't it?" It seemed that an image I showed on the screen had driven Stephen into a frenzy, but the real counterattack starts now. I'm going to show him how. My name is Melissa, and I'm 35 years old. 9 years ago, at the age of 26, I married Stephen. We met at a party. Stephen, 2 years older than me, was very kind, and we clicked immediately. As we started dating and thought about marriage, Stephen told me he intended to return to his hometown in the countryside to farm. The village, close to being a ghost town due to a declining population, felt a crisis of becoming desolate. I was surprised but eventually decided to follow Stephen's passionate request to join him. I too came from the countryside, albeit a different one. I had grown tired of living in an unfamiliar city. Luckily, my brother and his wife lived in my parents' house. Knowing that there was no need to take care of my parents later also pushed my decision. After that, things moved swiftly, and we got married. I quit my job and moved to this tiny village, Stephen's hometown. Though it's called a village, most of it consisted of Stephen's relatives. We lived in a large house originally inhabited by my in-laws, who then moved to a small annex on the next plot. They were cheerful and caring, always looking out for us. Farming was tough, but living surrounded by nature wasn't bad. Above all, the people of this village were kind. When I mentioned this, Stephen happily said, "It's all thanks to the Guardian." The Guardian is a statue located in the village square. Not only in the square, but similar statues were scattered throughout the village. Some homes even had stuffed toys modeled after the Guardian. This village had its unique traditions. Everyone revered the Guardian as a literal guardian deity. According to Stephen, the Guardian never overlooked evil deeds and never forgave the wicked. That's why all the villagers were good people. Such legends are probably found in any old village. Thinking about this, I didn't dwell on it much. Life was peaceful, and I had completely forgotten about such things. But a nightmare was surely approaching. A few years after moving in, I had become accustomed to farming. Waking up early and quickly harvesting vegetables was my daily routine. Every day was unremarkable, but one thing bothered me. We still hadn't had any children. I was about to turn 30. I had always thought it would happen naturally, but recently I started to feel anxious. This was because, after a few years, more people began asking, "Don't you have kids yet?" Each time, I cheerfully responded, "It's a blessing." But it's typical of an old farming village to bluntly ask such delicate questions. Everyone asked the same, even my in-laws, and occasionally, an old man or woman passing by asked bluntly, "Why can't you have them?" I responded appropriately, but it gradually became annoying. One day, after a break in harvesting, I was called by my mother-in-law while drinking water. "Hey Melissa, how are you managing your marital relations?" Caught off guard by such an absurd question, I nearly spit out my water. "It's strange that you haven't had children for so many years. Aren't you satisfying, Stephen?" An unimaginable statement came from my mother-in-law, and I was dumbfounded. In a panic, I said, "What are you talking about? Please stop. That's not something people normally discuss," and abruptly ended the conversation. Yet, my mother-in-law continued, "It's important, you know." But I ignored her and stormed out of the room. I thought this village had old-fashioned values, but this is just ridiculous. It's creepy that they boldly ask about marital life. Having left the house, I decided to kill some time by walking to the square. Then, I saw someone. Could it be a neighbor? I tensed up for a moment. I was worried they might start talking about children again. But when I saw her face, I was relieved. It was Emily, a woman who lives nearby. Emily smiled shyly. I smiled back. Emily is the only person in the village who doesn't make rude remarks to me. She's about 10 years younger than me, so she must be around 20 now. Emily isn't originally from this village. After her parents died in an accident, she was taken in by her distant relative, an old lady in this village. This happened just before I came to the village. After graduating from a high school nearby, she now helps out with her grandmother's orchard. We occasionally pass each other on the street, but she's quiet and not very talkative, so we don't really converse much. She doesn't hang out with anyone, so the villagers call her an oddball. I used to think Emily was a bit dull because she didn't interact much, but now I appreciate that she doesn't ask intrusive questions. I felt a bit cleansed thanks to Emily after the unpleasant experience with my mother-in-law. However, that didn't solve the problem. My mother-in-law, father-in-law, and other distant relatives in the neighborhood kept saying similar things. You need to be more assertive with your husband. You need to take the lead. They would say anything they wanted. My mother-in-law then said something that gave me chills. Last night's dinner was all vegetables. You should add more meat. Maybe adding garlic would boost Steven's vitality. Why does she even know what we had for dinner last night? It's too nosy. Fed up, I decided to talk to Steven about everything. I can't take it anymore. Everyone keeps asking about when we're going to have kids. Your mom also pressed too much into our marital life. Steven, who was watching TV, responded without taking his eyes off the screen. What are you talking about? Mom and everyone else are just worried about you. Worried? That's prying. Doesn't she say anything to you? Why would they say anything to me? Infertility is a woman's responsibility, isn't it? Steven casually said something unbelievable, and I was shocked that he had such outdated knowledge. I was appalled. It's not always the woman's fault. Sometimes it's a compatibility issue, or it could even be the man's fault. Me? No way. Steven looked genuinely puzzled. I understood the elderly in the village having old values, but I was surprised that even Steven, who was relatively young, thought this way. Anyway, I want a child too. I'm thinking about getting fertility treatment. We need to find the cause before we can address it. I suggested to Steven that we go to a doctor together. But as expected, Steven was reluctant and made excuses. Why should a man go to such a place? He complained. But I managed to persuade him to agree on the condition that we go to a hospital a bit far from the village. Later, we went to a hospital in another city and both got tested. A few weeks later, when we returned to the hospital, the doctor told us a fact. There's no issue with you, Melissa. The problem is with your husband. He does not produce sperm. He has azoospermia. The moment Steven heard this, he exploded. What? It can't be my fault. Are you kidding me? Steven suddenly stood up and started yelling. I had never seen Steven like this before. The doctor, with a troubled look, showed us the test results on paper. Staring at the paper, Steven fell silent with a terrible expression. He must have been shocked. I felt sorry for him and couldn't say anything. That night, I spoke to Steven kindly. The doctor said if we do more detailed tests, we might find the cause and get treatment. It's a bit far, but I'll help. But Steven just looked down and didn't reply. He probably never imagined that he could be the cause. Feeling sorry for him, I couldn't say anything more and silently left the room. But soon, I realized that feeling sympathy was a mistake. Steven's attitude began to worsen. The cruel truth of his azoospermia seemed to have shredded his pride as a man. Perhaps in an effort to regain his shattered self-esteem, he became unusually aggressive. I was the main target of his frustrations. He criticized me for being slow at farm work, for the food not being tasty enough, and he started picking fights over trivial things, growing angrier more frequently. Initially, I remained silent, thinking he just couldn't accept the test results, feeling sorry for him. But as it continued, I too began to lose my patience. Our arguments increased, turning our home into a constant battleground. Naturally, there was no intimacy, so having children was out of the question. Going to the hospital for treatment was absolutely out of the question. Moreover, the villagers still believed my infertility was to blame. The situation where I was the only one criticized remained unchanged. I wanted to tell Steven's parents the truth, but Steven glared at me with icy eyes, warning, "Don't tell anyone." The thought of what might happen if I spoke up was frightening, and I didn't have the courage to do it. Besides, I wasn't even sure if they would believe me. After all, everyone's thinking was outdated. The conventional belief that infertility is a woman's fault prevailed. That's probably why Steven had reacted so violently when he was pointed out as the cause. As this life continued, I started to feel I couldn't bear it anymore. I understood he was shocked, but this was outright displacement of blame, and I felt like a punching bag. Maybe it would be better to separate. I was beginning to think that way. Half a year passed, and Stephen's snide remarks continued. By then, I had reached my limit. I had firmly decided to get a divorce. However, the problem was the old-fashioned mindset of the village. Divorce was seen as disgraceful. I had heard rumors of a woman who suggested divorce being verbally abused by her husband. Considering this, it was unlikely I would get easy consent. So I thought about leaving the signed divorce papers and fleeing the village. It was a drastic measure, but I was driven to it. I began to prepare secretly so that Stephen wouldn't notice. Then, the next month, Stephen was supposed to be out of the village for the day delivering crops. It was the perfect opportunity. But while I was packing my bags, the front door opened. There stood Stephen, who was supposed to be out. His eyes were furious as he shouted, "Where are you going?" When I remained silent, Stephen glanced at the divorce papers on the desk. "You were going to divorce me. Are you kidding me? If people find out my wife ran away, it would be a disgrace. Don't you dare embarrass me." It was the reaction I had expected. After a tirade of abuse, he threatened, "If you ever think about running away again, you know what will happen," and glared at me sharply. My plan had failed. I was desperate. Yet how had he found out? I had been careful to act discreetly. From then on, Stephen's treatment of me worsened. He complained that the cleaning wasn't thorough, that just seeing my face irritated him. Any backtalk from me would lead to serious trouble. "You are the worst kind of woman, running away from her husband. The guardian sees everything. Your misdeeds will be exposed." That became Stephen's mantra. Lately, even the mention of the guardian by the villagers started to disgust me. I had thought it was just superstition. But could that statue really be watching me? It's hard to believe that those trying to escape the village receive punishment. But the fact that my whereabouts and actions were precisely guessed was indeed true. I had become utterly frightened. Gradually, a sense of resignation began to grow within me. As time passed, I was about to turn 35. One day, Emily, who lives nearby, came to visit. "It's rare to see you. What's up?" Over time, Emily and I had started to talk a bit whenever we met. Unlike the other villagers who thrived on rumors and judged harshly, Emily never pried into my life and always treated me with unchanged kindness, the only woman who did so. "Melissa, there's something I really need to say." I was taken aback by the seriousness on Emily's face. I invited her inside and made some coffee. Then Emily looked around nervously and gestured for me to come closer without saying a word. We entered a room that was now used as a storage room and seldom entered. What's going on?" As I followed her in, confused, I asked her this question, and she murmured as if relieved, "We should be safe here." Then she began to pour out her words as if a dam had burst. "I can't take it anymore. This village actually—" That's when she told me a shocking fact. It was about the true nature of this terrifying village. Months later, Emily and I had met secretly several times. After learning the truth about the village, we had been trying to figure out a way to escape. The truth Emily shared was shocking. Hearing such things only made me more eager to escape as soon as possible. But we needed to act carefully. If our plan was discovered, it would be over. It took time, but finally, the day to act was set. This Sunday, a banquet related to the guardian held once every few years would gather all the village relatives. We couldn't miss this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Emily and I had discussed and done what needed to be done. Everything was prepared. All that was left was to put our plan into action. The gathering was at night. The venue was the village's only restaurant. Although the building was old, it had enough capacity to accommodate most of the villagers. Like years ago, I went there in the afternoon to help, as I had helped before. My in-laws were there, so I greeted them with, "Good morning." However, after a brief glance at me, they quickly disappeared somewhere. Maybe they were busy. Thinking so, I decided to help with preparing the food. But not just my in-laws. The other relatives, too, were unresponsive to anything I asked. In fact, to be honest, they were ignoring me. Had I done something wrong? Confused, time passed, and it became night. Soon, the relatives and other villagers began to arrive. Stephen was among them. But his attitude was the same. For some reason, he ignored me. It felt like I had become a ghost. Without understanding why, only anxiety and irritation grew within me. So I pretended to go to the restroom to secretly listen to their conversations. Then a terrifying conversation hit my ears. Melissa never did have children, did she? At her age, it's probably impossible now. Oh dear, an infertile daughter-in-law is just bad luck. She must be cursed by the guardian. My mother-in-law began with a tone of disgust, and a clearly drunk Stephen nodded in agreement. Yeah, talking to such an unlucky person might curse us too. It's better for everyone not to deal with her. Of course, I made sure to inform the villagers last night. I told them that speaking to Melissa would bring the guardian curse. My father-in-law added with a laugh. Hearing their words, I began to shake with anger. Unforgivable. It wasn't my fault I couldn't have children, and to think to be deemed an ominous presence, to be ignored on top of that. Is this what adults do? No matter how you look at it, this village is wrong. We should carry out our plan immediately. We intended to flee this village, but that alone wasn't enough to settle my feelings. I had to somehow strike back at them. I was resolved. Soon, Emily appeared from the venue. The timing was perfect. Without saying a word, Emily and I nodded to each other. Then I turned off the lights at the venue. Suddenly, it was dark, and voices could be heard asking, "What happened? Is it a power outage?" Amidst the confusion, Emily tampered with a computer that was placed in a corner of the venue. Originally, there was a computer, projector, and screen set up for today's event to reflect on the guardian and the history of the village. We decided to use that setup. After a while, a certain image appeared on the screen. "What is this?" Stephen screamed. My in-laws, other relatives, and villagers were also staring at the screen, causing a commotion. "Who did this? Melissa, where are you?" Stephen became frantic and started causing a scene. Emily and I decided to retreat for the moment. We discreetly left the venue and met outside. About 3 minutes had passed since we escaped when my phone began to vibrate repeatedly. It was Stephen, calling relentlessly. "Melissa, what have you done?" He screamed in agony as soon as I answered. I chuckled. "What are you panicking for? It's the truth, isn't it?" It seemed like everyone was under the wrong impression, so I just wanted to set the record straight. The image projected was the result of a medical examination from years ago. It was a diagnosis that confirmed Stephen's azoospermia. The large text displayed on the big screen was enough to astonish everyone present at the venue. Stephen, having his closely guarded secret exposed, was in a state of panic. He seemed extremely confused and kept shouting incoherently. He was making so much noise that I quickly hung up the phone. My phone kept vibrating afterward, but of course I ignored it. Emily looked at me with concern. "Is everything okay?" "Just as I expected, but we need to push a little more." The harm I had suffered wasn't something I could just let go of. Emily and I returned to the banquet hall together. Peeking into the venue, it had turned into a scene of utter chaos. "Is this really true? You were infertile, Stephen." "It can't be." Everyone was confronting Stephen. His face turned pale as he kept saying, "This is a lie. It's a conspiracy by Melissa," sweating profusely as he made excuses. The villagers had believed that our inability to have children was my fault, the woman's fault. But the truth was different. At the time of the examination, there was nothing about me that could cause infertility. It was Stephen's azoospermia that had prevented us from having children. Yet, without being able to tell the truth, I was blamed. I was reproached as if not having children was a sin, and my existence was ignored. The numerous verbal abuses and the painful days I had to endure were not something I could forgive. Emily and I entered the buzzing venue. "Melissa, what are you doing?" Stephen shouted at me. "Don't mess with me. Doing something like this, you'll be cursed by the guardian. You'll face terrible consequences." At his words, I snapped. "What guardian? You were just spying with security cameras." How creepy. As I said this, the room fell silent. Hitting the nail on the head, Stephen, my in-laws, and the villagers turned pale. Yes, the guardian was not a protective deity. In fact, surveillance cameras were installed inside the guardian. Cameras were hidden not only inside the stone statues around the village, but also inside the stuffed toys of the guardian that were displayed in our living rooms. These were monitored by board elders in a room at the community center who watched the actions of outsiders. That's why my attempts to escape were well known. I had learned this from Emily on that day about 10 years ago, Around the time Emily was taken in by an elderly woman in the village after losing her parents. Lonely, Emily had once secretly followed her grandmother to work because she missed her. Her grandmother went to the community center. There, she and the elders laughed and chatted while watching the villagers through surveillance cameras. At that moment, Emily learned about the village's secret legacy of the guardian cameras. Shocked, Emily somewhat understood the village atmosphere. The rumors spread so quickly. This was it. It was bad enough to be the subject of idle gossip, but being watched while walking down the street or even inside the house was too much. Emily despised the village's tendency to invade others' privacy. Emily tried to stay out of the gossip, so the villagers started calling her odd for not joining their circle. She was fed up with the village, but she had no relatives and nowhere else to go. She had no choice but to endure life there. But one day, as her 25th birthday approached, her grandmother began pressuring her to go on arranged dates. "You need to have children soon, or you'll end up infertile like Melissa," she was told, and persistently pushed to marry an elderly widower living on the edge of the village. Naturally, Emily refused such an unreasonable demand. However, her grandmother began to threaten her, saying that such defiance would bring the curse of the guardian upon her. When Emily could no longer bear it, she thought of me, hoping I could help. Knowing the tragic experiences I had faced due to gossip, she approached me to escape the village together. The reason Emily had moved from the living room to another room that day without speaking was because she had spotted a guardian plushie there. I hadn't paid any attention. I thought it was just another plushie common around the village, but there was a camera hidden inside it. It was likely installed by Steven to monitor my activities. That explained why my every move seemed to be known when I tried to escape, and even when my mother-in-law accurately guessed what we had for dinner. Because they were watching through the camera. It was obvious to them. I felt a chill at the sheer horror of it. My instincts told me it was dangerous to stay in this village. Kicking up Emily's suggestion, we decided we must escape the village as soon as possible. We planned together, but was escaping enough? I felt I couldn't rest without avenging the years of mistreatment. I thought about it. First, I had to clear my own name. And then, "Emily, did you talk, traitor?" her foster grandmother yelled furiously. But Emily glared back at her. "I appreciate that you took me in when I had no one, but I can't stand living like this, sneaking around, peeking into other people's lives, living off gossip and backstabbing. I absolutely hate it." "How could you say that?" The grandmother and the other villagers began to make a commotion. To silence them, I decided to deliver the final blow. I manipulated the computer and displayed new images on the screen. The images that appeared one after another shocked everyone. Steven was flirting with a young woman in the village. My mother-in-law secretly added the juice of a dirty rat to the coffee she served at village meetings. My father-in-law put his hands around the shoulders and waist of a married woman. Emily's grandmother was stealing vegetables from someone's garden. Almost all the villagers were caught in embarrassing acts they wouldn't want to be known. Everyone at the venue was speechless. Steven exclaimed, "When did you take these pictures? How is it possible to capture such compromising photos of everyone?" Emily explained. It was impossible that all the villagers were good people. Knowing where the cameras were, they would have acted in the blind spots if they had anything to hide. We focused on the blind spots, places that were out of sight of the guardian statues and plushies, and identified the most convenient spots for misdeeds to occur, where we planted our own small cameras purchased online. Then the village scandals just kept coming out. The villagers were naturally committing minor wrongs in places they thought were not covered by cameras. They had claimed all along that all the villagers were good people. It was truly laughable. We captured crucial moments from the camera footage and saved them, and now we expose those images in broad daylight. An eye for an eye. Since my privacy was violated, I did the same to them. This should teach them how deplorable it is to indulge in spreading rumors about others. The villagers fell silent in shame. "What do you mean all villagers are good people? Just a bunch of scum. You enjoy spying on outsiders and having a laugh. Give me a break. I don't want to stay in this outdated, privacy-less village for one more second." I shouted loudly and thrust the divorce papers in front of Steven. Caught off guard, Steven stood frozen, mouth agape. My in-laws and villagers were also stunned. They'd probably never thought I would fight back. Indeed, there was a time when I almost gave up, but now with Emily as my ally, Finding a way out, I could no longer just sit back and take it. I looked down quietly at them, stunned. "Goodbye, pitiful everyone," echoed Emily, her gaze full of contempt for the villagers. We left the banquet hall without looking back. Once outside, we picked up 2 suitcases that we had hidden in the barn. These contained all the essentials we needed for our new lives. The divorce papers were already left at the house, and now with these suitcases, all we had to do was walk out of the village. However, as we were leaving, I suddenly stopped in my tracks. "What's wrong?" Emily asked, puzzled. "I just have to do this," I said, grabbing a hoe that was leaning against a farmhouse. I headed to the square and swung the hoe with all my might. A tremendous noise erupted as the statue of the Guardian was spectacularly destroyed. Of course, the surveillance camera inside it shattered into pieces as well. "That was quite spectacular, Melissa. There's no point in leaving that thing intact." That felt refreshing. We laughed together. Then we destroyed every single small Guardian statue throughout the village. Naturally, we had already thrown away any related plushies inside the house. It's incredible to think how frightening this setup was. The Guardian statues were originally created long ago to scare misbehaving children. "The Guardian will scold you if you do something bad" was an effective piece of education back then. But as times changed, this method of teaching young children evolved into a tool for punishing anyone the villagers disliked. It mainly targeted people like me who came from outside the village and those like Emily who did not try to blend in. Initially, it was just a way for people to gather and nitpick on those who did not conform to village norms. It probably started as just a bit of idle gossip to pass the time. However, over time, this gossip evolved into a network of surveillance cameras, ensuring constant monitoring in this closed-off village. The absurd superstition of the Guardian became a normalized justification for spying on others. Not only is it problematic to expose people's privacy, but the persistence in outdated thinking is equally troubling. The negative energy filling this warped village eventually seemed to corrode the hearts of its residents more than any curse or retribution. I have come to find human actions far more frightening. I refuse to stay in such a place any longer. We left the backward, rotten village behind without a backward glance. Later, I heard through the grapevine that infighting had begun among the villagers after I exposed their wrongdoings. Following ugly disputes, the villagers split up, and communication completely broke down, impacting even their farming activities. Lack of coordination led to frequent mistakes, and blame shifting began. Naturally, the quality of vegetables deteriorated, and the agricultural cooperative started to complain. The village could no longer sell its produce. As a result, almost everyone fell into poverty. As for Stephen, he managed to get divorced. Worried that he wouldn't file the divorce papers I had left at home, I consulted a lawyer after leaving the village. The lawyer intervened, and it turned out Stephen did fill out and submit the divorce papers. He apparently remarried quickly because he wanted to be with the woman he had an affair with, who lived on the outskirts of the village. But with the village facing a food shortage, Stephen's household was also struggling to make ends meet. The woman he remarried eventually left him. My in-laws were also out of money and spent their days in constant quarrels. No matter how miserable they became, I could not muster any sympathy for them. I never want to have anything to do with them again, nor do I wish to remember them. As for Emily and me, we are now living peacefully in a new place. However, the journey here was not easy. Emily had no relatives, and at my parents' home, my brother and his wife were living, so I couldn't impose on them. After leaving the village, we had no one to rely on. That's why we had already started looking for jobs in secret before we left. Because of the surveillance cameras, we couldn't move around too openly. We planned our meetings in a camera-free storage shed and arranged everything via computer. This took some time, but after several online interviews, I finally found a job. My experience in clerical work before I got married came in handy. I was hired as a temporary employee, which was fine by me. We had also found a small place to live. No matter how cramped, it was far better than the village environment. Since Emily had no experience outside of farm work and was struggling to find a job, she decided to live with me in my place while looking for work. Soon after we left the village, Emily secured a job. Fortunately, being in her 20s and willing to start in an entry-level position helped despite her lack of experience. Eventually, my hard work was recognized, and I was promoted to a permanent employee. My salary increased, and I was able to move from a small place to a condo. Subsequently, Emily became independent and moved into a nearby condo. Now, we both have made friends at work and in our community, enjoying every day. Leaving the village was truly the best decision. There was a time when I lost my husband, my home, and my job, but by having the courage to start anew, I was able to reshape my life. I wish I could tell my past self not to give up. By acting with hope and not giving up, I have achieved the life I have today. The thought that my mother-in-law won't be around for much longer is a comfort. I took some paid time off to spend a night away from the house where I live with my in-laws to attend my youngest brother's wedding. As I packed my overnight bag, my mother-in-law's voice called out after me, "Why don't you just never come back? And while you're at it, why don't you get a divorce and leave?" I smiled subtly, accepting her malice, and left the house without looking back. I paused to say goodbye to our house before going too far. I appreciated everything it had done for me despite my mother-in-law's lack of attention. Carrying a somewhat large bag, I hurried to the location where my dear family awaited. The hotel would be my home for 3 days and 2 nights, and my mother-in-law had no idea I wouldn't be returning. What happens next is still a secret. I'm Selena Jason, a 48-year-old part-time employee, balancing the management of our hectic home with my office work. Dean and I have been married for over 30 years. Despite our arranged marriage, we get along well and share similar values. The only challenge in our relationship is Dean's career as a sailor, which often keeps him away for over a year at a time. We are blessed with a son, and our connection remains strong. Until recently, we lived with my in-laws, primarily caring for Dean's grandmother. I manage her care almost entirely on my own, paying a caretaker during the day. This arrangement continued until her passing. Tears filled my eyes as Dean expressed his gratitude for the attention I gave her. She spent her last years surrounded by great-grandchildren and received excellent care. Though Dean's profession keeps him away, I'm proud of his significant contributions to American logistics. After her grandmother's death, my mother-in-law's behavior changed drastically. She once tried to be kind to me while pushing all the caregiving duties onto me, but once I stopped, she began to completely disregard me. She would exclude me from outings and intentionally bump into me within the home. Her blatant hostility was unsettling. During one of Dean's absences, my son Russell mentioned, "Grandma's saying nasty things again." When Russell was only 4 or 5, my mother-in-law made up stories to convince him that my father hated me and that I was cheating on Dean, which she claimed was why Dean didn't come home. Discovering these falsehoods left me astounded. I was diligently doing domestic tasks and working hard every day, not cheating. Dean's absences were due to his job, not my actions. Convincing a child of such lies was absurd. I focused on calming a worried Russell rather than dwelling on her words. I was relieved when Dean returned and reprimanded her for her behavior. Now that Dean is back, my mother-in-law seems to be making the most of his presence by keeping me busy. Despite the caregiving being over, she insists on meticulous cleaning and gives me difficult recipes to follow. Recently, she hosted a drama marathon, inviting local ladies over, leaving a mess of drink spills and food wrappers for me to clean up. It added more work during an already hectic time before dinner. I was sweating from the cleanup, irritated by her constant demands to hurry up and make supper. She claimed to be too full from snacks, but didn't even sit at the table for dinner. Russell's complaint that my mother-in-law said she didn't like me and that I should go away only made me more irate. He suggested it might be best if we lived apart from her. After calming down Russell and preparing him for bed, I knew I needed to have a serious conversation with Dean. One day, after Russell left, I suddenly started to feel sick. I was sweating, my face was hot, and my limbs were freezing. My menopausal symptoms were especially bad on that specific day. Since last year, I've been feeling strange, and the doctors have determined that it's menopause. They were monitoring my condition without prescribing anything, but there were difficult days. I questioned if the stress from my mother-in-law's actions was affecting my health. By nightfall, I felt worse and found myself resting in my room. My mother-in-law was yelling at me to come to supper as I heard her approaching. I was having trouble simply sitting up. I thought about pretending to be asleep, but she pulled the cover off me. She clapped her hands and demanded supper, so I reluctantly sat up. Given that my grandmother-in-law used to manage the kitchen, I reasoned that if my mother-in-law wanted supper, she should prepare it herself. Lately, it had just been me in the kitchen. My mother-in-law hardly ever went in there except to set the dishes while Dean was home. Maybe she wasn't a good chef. I told her I was having trouble with menopause and couldn't do the chores today since I was so tired. Having experienced menopausal symptoms herself, I thought she would understand. Her response, though, was far from empathetic. She snorted, turned a sack over my head, and I screamed a little in the darkened room as things fell down around me. I was nauseous after waking up but wasn't sure why right away. A minute later, I discovered the fragrance surrounding me was that of potatoes. My mother-in-law had thrown snack crumbs all over me, and the bag she'd have flipped upside down was almost empty. It was so unexpected that I was taken aback. With a tongue click, she exited the room. I lay in bed, hurting, reprimanded, and drenched in crumbs. Rather than being angry, I experienced an odd, almost dreamlike feeling, as though I was seeing something peculiar. My patience was beginning to wear thin. I took a paid leave of absence from work about 6 months later to prepare for a trip to my younger brother's wedding. After living together for a few years, he was finally getting married to his girlfriend. Their house is in New York, so I made reservations for a 3-day, 2-night stay at a hotel. Despite my brother's offer to pay, I chose to handle the hotel expenses myself since I wanted to set my own hours. Although it was a modest ceremony with just relatives, I was looking forward to attending because it was a rare opportunity for everyone to be together. I planned a week's worth of meals ahead of time, figuring no one else would be cooking during my vacation. I told my in-laws about the meals I had made and put in the fridge the evening before I left. During supper, my mother-in-law appeared unhappy, but my father-in-law praised me. "What's the deal with all the fuss? It's your brother's wedding. Why even attend? Isn't this simply a remarriage? Probably nothing noteworthy," she scowled, more than just a stare. My father-in-law gave her a look. "Actually, both my brother and his partner are getting married for the first time," I corrected her. My mother-in-law seemed to be misinterpreting the situation as she laughed crudely. "A first marriage at 40 must indicate a personal issue with him. Even though your brother is young, why is he getting married in style?" "Insolent," she said. It seemed she had either forgotten my family structure or was mistaking my brother for someone else. In reality, I have 3 brothers, and my youngest brother is still very young. Considering we are separated by 14 years, my youngest brother, who is in his early 30s, is marrying a woman in her 20s. My mother-in-law was insulted by the correction when I told her this. Her next statement was even more snide, comparing the age difference between a parent and child to that of a girlfriend in her 20s. It surprised me that she wouldn't listen. My father-in-law cleared his throat as if he realized what had happened. "She's not just 20, she's in her 20s, I attempted to explain. Their ages barely differ by 4 or 5 years. That seems sensible, doesn't it?" She appeared rather reasonable when we chatted on a video conference. Lately, I wrapped up my conversation with my in-laws and got ready to head out. I made sure I had everything I needed in my bag and prepared a gorgeous attire for the wedding. From the living room, I could hear my mother-in-law speaking loudly and angrily to my father-in-law. Knowing it would be best to avoid any confrontation, I decided to leave the house as quickly as possible. Feeling a surge of anger, I rolled my somewhat overweight bag towards the front entrance. The following morning, I was briefly stopped by my mother-in-law's parting remarks. "Never come back, and why don't you just get a divorce?" "Yes, as you wish," I replied happily, sounding more composed than I had anticipated. I had long since reached my breaking point and felt more relieved than I realized. Dean had helped me prepare for this day. My mother-in-law laughed and munched on some snacks, seemingly oblivious to the circumstances. The amount of food she could consume first thing in the morning surprised me. I chose to walk to the station. As I turned to look back at the house before continuing, I thought I really owed this house a lot, except for my mother-in-law. For a very long time, Dean, Russell, my father-in-law, and my grandmother-in-law had made this house feel like home. I even felt like I owed the walls and roof. But I didn't remember ever needing my mother-in-law's assistance. I felt so silly for some reason. With somewhat excessive luggage, I hastened to meet my dear family. I was about to move into a new apartment and live alone after spending 3 days and 2 nights at a motel. I met Dean at the wedding location. He was the one we had invited, and when he saw me coming, he handed me a pen and an unsigned divorce document. We decided that signing it would be the last thing we did together as a couple. "Many thanks. Together. Let's complete it when we return to the hotel. I hope it's acceptable that I reserved a twin room," I added. My brother's marriage today is a sad event but also represents a fresh start for us. We'll disclose the divorce later and not in front of everyone today. Dean and I exchange a warm smile, both of us realizing the momentous step we were about to take. It seemed so weighty to even consider signing that one piece of paper, representing the dissolution of our more than 30-year marriage. Dean comforted me, saying that being with him had always made me truly happy, so I apologized. I didn't mind that he was frequently away from home for work because I knew this from the beginning. Well, except for his mother. Apologize not. You've made a fantastic spouse, I added. Let's stay close friends moving forward. With all the affection I could muster, Dean clasped my hand in tears and thanked me once again, bringing tears to my eyes as well. I decided to blame my emotions on joy for my brother's wedding. Dean went back to his parents' house by himself the following day. He gave his in-laws an explanation of the circumstances, and at first, they were taken aback by the abrupt discussion of divorce. When they heard the whole tale, my father-in-law lost his temper. He yelled, frightening my mother-in-law. How dare you drive out someone who cared for my mother until the end? My father-in-law had been a great support and caring partner, even though I had been the one doing most of the physical labor and taking care of my grandmother-in-law. It seems that my father-in-law had secretly grumbled about my mother-in-law's lack of contribution. He went up to her and voiced his complaints. Since entering the family through marriage, you have never been good at cleaning. You gave birth to our baby, so I remained mute. However, you have taken advantage of my mother's indulgence to avoid lending a hand. Selena accomplished everything. You're nothing like her, he said. The comparison to me made him even more enraged. You ought to have been the one to depart. It is incomprehensible that we lost a devoted daughter-in-law like Selena who gave us so much. You have made no financial contribution at all. My mother-in-law's stance was undermined when money was brought up. Dean's pay covered all family costs, and she had never worked outside the home. Even though our family was wealthy, I continued to work because I enjoyed it. My income supported the family by paying for theater tickets, vacations, and special occasion fine meals. These actions were investments in getting me some alone time. Dean, it's not too late. Seeing the seriousness of the situation, my father-in-law at last advised, go apologize and ask Selena to marry you again. Despite her distress and desperation, my mother-in-law was powerless to avert the fallout from her actions. This is the home I constructed, my father-in-law furiously said. You need to leave, and he started to evict her. In a fit of rage, my mother-in-law screamed and scratched at her tangled hair. Observers found her conduct strange and disturbing. No, I'm not going anywhere. I refuse to be divorced at this age. How am I meant to live alone? She said. My father-in-law was physically stronger than her, so he ultimately succeeded in dragging her out of the house despite her struggle. He forcefully closed and locked the door, leaving her to sob loudly, clutching it. The neighbors were frightened by the disturbance and phoned the police. When the police came, my father-in-law opened the door, but his rage lingered for several days. The atmosphere in the house was tense. My father-in-law and mother-in-law avoided one another and even ran away when they saw each other in the same room. It was as though they were living apart. My father-in-law called a family gathering after his distant daughter was put in an unsustainable circumstance. He said, I'm going to divorce her, but his daughter objected, expressing compassion for my mother-in-law, which made things more difficult to talk about. Dean described the abuse I was subjected to, including the way my mother-in-law had deceived our kid to incite him against me. He talked about my menopausal pain and showed emails from our kid as proof. Having seen it all, my father-in-law voiced his dissatisfaction, saying my mother-in-law had disobeyed his advice to halt her actions and apologize. Dean also brought up how I handled home duties and my grandmother-in-law's care, asking his sister what she would think if her own mother-in-law had acted in the same way. She remained mute when asked which side she would support. Enraged, my mother-in-law bemoaned that her daughter had betrayed her and claimed to have betrayed herself. Her sardonic honesty amused me since, as I discovered, our grandmother was the one who raised us most of the time, something I had always worried about in our family. Mom used to spend a lot of time with her neighbors, chatting about her old days. His sister had looked at my mother-in-law with contempt after learning about the bullying. Ultimately, the only housewives who made a significant contribution were myself and my grandmother-in-law, whom I took care of until her death. Despite having 2 kids, my mother-in-law often shied away from cleaning and took pleasure in the advantages with little effort. Her status was undermined when the family ultimately discovered her pattern of carelessness. My mother-in-law halted her tirades, realized her situation, and started crying. Ultimately, compassion prevented a divorce, but my father-in-law is still considering it. I told my father-in-law that I would want to meet with him when I heard this. After I left, Dean told me about these incidents. He said, "Dad should have supported Selena from the beginning if he was going to get so upset now. However, I wasn't present, so what could I say?" Sipping his steaming coffee, Dean moaned. We were in our beloved cafe, a spot we have loved since we were little. I selected a soft drink, something I hadn't had in a while, whereas Dean got a coffee. I grinned softly as I heard the specifics of my mother-in-law's shameful actions. "Be kind to yourself. Your crucial work required you to be gone. You are relied upon by many," I said sincerely. It is wonderful that Dean, while being gone for years at a time, supports people via marine transportation in his capacity as a sailor. I apologize for this inconvenience, but that's why I've been putting up with it. You have my continued admiration and respect, yet I am unable to stay in your parents' household. At last I said what had been on my mind for a very long time. Though he seemed a little dejected, Dean nodded in agreement. I was relieved that he did not blindly support his parents. I couldn't help but grin widely, and Dean gave me an obviously amazed look. Dean later said that he believed my smile was brighter than it had ever been at that very time. Dean also seemed more endearing than ever to me. Dean assisted me in seeing his father the day following our cafe meeting. It was time for my last bit of retaliation. Dean's father was dressed more elegantly than usual when he showed up at the cafe. I briefly discussed the weather before getting right to the point. "Dean told me that you're thinking about divorcing your wife. It's doable while you're still well. But after all this chaos, managing it on your own will be difficult. I'm willing to assist with your latter years of care if you do decide to split." This obviously thrilled his father. Dean could spend a lot of time at sea, and his sister resided far away. He had never been one to help out around the house with cooking, cleaning, or washing, so after seeing his mother through to the end, he would definitely be grateful for my assistance. He crossed his arms and scowled, saying, "Of course I'll separate from her." No, hold on, perhaps getting a divorce would be better. I hoped my mother-in-law would be fully removed from the matter since she was quite likely to be removed. Her circumstances looked to be getting worse. If I were to suddenly pass away, she'd probably make a huge fuss, he thought. It's better to divorce her properly before that happens. Dean seemed to steel himself as his father talked with increasing determination. Once he makes up his mind, his father usually follows through on it, sometimes going a little too far, but that's just his personality. After years of cohabiting with him, I smiled and nodded in accord, knowing how to handle him. This kind of little prodding would probably get him to follow through. Dean laughed and saw what I was trying to do but didn't step in. He appeared to be much more irritated than I was by my mother-in-law's actions. Suddenly full of energy, his father sprang up to get the divorce papers. I chose to help him out of goodwill by introducing him to the attorney Dean, and I had consulted for our divorce. My mother-in-law was doomed to live a lonely existence after that day since my father-in-law aggressively pursued the divorce. After a week, I went back to my old house, which was now simply my ex-in-law's place. I went to get possessions that I had previously been unable to take. Even though I had removed most of the items, there were still clothing, books, sentimental mementos, drawings from my son's early years, bedding and furniture that I had paid for with my own money. I had gathered a lot of personal belongings in the residence over the years. I ended up seeing my mother-in-law for the last time on this visit. She was clearly in a panic, as her divorce had already been settled by that point. She knelt in front of me as I collected my possessions, her face pale, and she started apologizing. "Margaret, I sincerely apologize. I ask you please, it was a joke. Kindly return and convince your spouse," she pleaded. I ignored my mother-in-law's pleadings and kept packing. She got to her feet quickly, insulting me and going back to her old ways, furious at my lack of interest. "How can you disregard me when I'm acting so modestly? Since being a member of this family, you have only caused problems. Simply depart and pass away by yourself," she screamed. He barked and spat at me after hurling a string of less complex, unrepeatable slurs. I ignored her again and concentrated on putting my belongings in a cardboard box. She let out a sudden cry and rushed towards the box, turning it over. Startled, I ducked as she had a fit, kicking and stomping the clothing, scattering them across the floor. Enough? Dean scowled at his mother and yelled. His normally submissive nature had grown into a powerful figure, surprising his mother despite his habit of complying. I turned to my mother-in-law and held Dean back with one hand while maintaining a neutral look. I am not your daughter-in-law anymore. You are not my mother-in-law anymore. We are no longer in a relationship. I'm grateful for nothing. It was not you but your father-in-law and grandmother that assisted me. I hurried over the jumbled garments and stuffed them into the box without folding any of them. Strange, don't touch my belongings. Farewell, I said, directing a final remark at my messy mother-in-law. I hurried out of the room, ready to be away from her. I gave Dean a call to take care of the stuff that was left. I waited for my brother to go after getting into his car. My mother-in-law was still screaming inside the home, but I wasn't going to waste time listening. I heard her weep in sorrow and keep beating her own head after we departed. She appeared to regret cutting off her final hope, but there was never going to be a possibility for reconciliation. Sadly, it was too late for her regrets to be significant. My mother-in-law was ultimately forced to move out and started living alone in a small apartment about a month later. Every now and again, Dean and his sister stop over to see how she's doing. I've heard that she resides indoors most of the time, hardly takes a shower, and wears her old clothing as pajamas. She spends her days eating cheap snacks and fast food and complaining about how poor her life is. Even though she and my father-in-law divided some assets during the divorce, it wasn't much, which meant she would be financially unstable as she aged. Personally, I'm not offering any assistance. Is that not evident? Dean's mother was always proud of him because he was a well-paid sailor. It never occurred to her that her own kid might cut her off altogether. Ironically, she is now the one who is unable to return, despite having previously advised me to leave and obtain a divorce. Similar to the proverb, curses return upon those who curse, my mother-in-law ought to have been prepared to deal with her own bad luck if she cast bad luck wishes on other people. I live a quiet life with my cat in an apartment approximately 30 minutes away from my former in-law's house. 5 years after the divorce, I chose this location since it would make my commute to work easier. The rental is a nice property with plenty of sunlight and is pet-friendly. Every week, I still go see my ex-father-in-law and make him different meals. Since the divorce, our relationship seems to have improved. Considering how much I still assist, my distant sister-in-law can scarcely meet my sight. Dean and I communicate frequently. We make it a point to go on dates as soon as he gets back from his lengthy maritime travels. It's like opening a fresh chapter. Though we are relatively new to this, we like going to movies and museums, and our relationship seems new and exciting. We find it quite delightful to talk and communicate for hours on end. On his days off, Russell comes over to visit and makes jokes about our fake divorce, joking, "You two just went back to being lovers, didn't you?" However, the fact is that Dean and I never had a romantic relationship in the first place. Our marriage was planned. We seem to be developing a love relationship for the first time right now. We even have a cover agreement that says we will remarry if we are ever totally free from his mother, whether she dies, moves in with his sister, or enters a facility. Dean proposes that this would be the point at which his mother would no longer require welfare checks. Talks have already started on whether his sister and her husband would put her in a facility or begin living with her. Our get-together could not be too far off. It seems a little awkward to discuss, but after more than 30 years together, and as we approach our 50s, I'm excited about the possibility of falling in love with Dean, for whom I've always had a great deal of affection. The knife sliced through the air, missing my ear by a hair's breadth. I froze, my heart pounding as I stared at my mother-in-law, Jane, who stood there with a maniacal grin, brandishing the cake knife like a weapon. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Ava dear," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. My hand must have slipped. "Here, let me cut you a slice of cake." Cake. I stepped back, my hands trembling. "No thank you, Jane. I think I've lost my appetite." Matthew, my husband, rushed to my side. "Mom, what the hell? You could have hurt Ava." Jane's face crumpled into a mask of innocence. "Oh, Matthew, don't be silly. It was an accident. Ava knows I'd never hurt her intentionally, don't you, dear?" I bit my tongue, fighting the urge to scream. This was supposed to be a joyous family gathering to celebrate Matthew's promotion, but leave it to Jane to turn it into a nightmare. I think we should go, I whispered to Matthew, tugging at his sleeve. He nodded, his jaw clenched. Yeah, I think that's best. Dad, we're heading out. George, Matthew's father, looked up from his plate, bewildered. But you've barely touched your food. What's the rush? Ask your wife, Matthew snapped, grabbing our coats. As we made our way to the door, Jane's saccharine voice followed us. Leaving so soon? But I made your favorite dessert, Matthew. Don't you want to stay? I could see the conflict in Matthew's eyes. He loved his mother despite her quirks, but he loved me too, and I knew he was torn. We'll take some to go, Mom, he said finally, his voice strained. Jane's eyes narrowed, but she plastered on a smile. Of course, darling. Let me wrap that up for you. As she disappeared into the kitchen, I turned to Matthew. We can't keep doing this, I hissed. Your mother is out of control. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. I know. But what can I do? She's my mother. She's a menace, I retorted. And if we don't do something, she's going to destroy our marriage. Before Matthew could respond, Jane reappeared, holding a Tupperware container. Here you go, sweetie. I made sure to give you an extra large piece. As Matthew took the container, Jane's eyes locked with mine, the hatred in her gaze unmistakable. Drive safe now, she said, her voice sickly sweet. And Ava dear, do try to be more careful around sharp objects. We wouldn't want any accidents. I felt a chill run down my spine as we left the house. In the car, I turned to Matthew. You heard that, right? That wasn't just me. He sighed, starting the engine. I heard it. Look, I'll talk to her, okay? She'll come around eventually. I snorted. Yeah, right? And pigs might fly. As we drove home in tense silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Jane had always disliked me, but tonight felt different, more dangerous. I glanced at the Tupperware container on my lap, suddenly suspicious. Matthew, pull over. What? Why? Just do it. He complied, and I got out of the car, opening the container. The smell hit me first, acrid and wrong. I dumped the contents onto the grass and gasped. Matthew, look at this. He came around the car, his eyes widening as he saw the cake. It was laced with something, tiny white crystals that definitely weren't sugar. Oh my God, he whispered, she wouldn't? But we both knew the truth. Jane had crossed the line, and there was no going back. As we stood there staring at the tainted cake in the moonlight, I knew our lives would never be the same. The war with Jane had begun, and I was determined to win, no matter the cost. I stared at the photo album, my fingers tracing the edges of a picture from 5 years ago. There I was, beaming in my white dress, Matthew at my side, and there, just behind us, was Jane, her smile as brittle as glass. Penny for your thoughts? Matthew's voice startled me from my reverie. I snapped the album shut, just remembering the day I met your mother. God, I was so naive. Matthew sighed, settling beside me on the couch. You couldn't have known, Ava. None of us did. But I should have. The signs were there from the very beginning. I closed my eyes, remembering that fateful day 5 years ago. Matthew and I had just gotten engaged and were heading to his parents' house for dinner. I was nervous, eager to make a good impression. Jane had opened the door, her perfectly coiffed hair and immaculate outfit making me feel underdressed in my work clothes. You must be Ava, she'd said, her eyes sweeping over me critically. I thought you'd be taller. I'd laughed it off then, chalking it up to nerves, but as the evening wore on, Jane's barbs became sharper, more pointed. So Ava, she'd said over dessert, Matthew tells me you're quite career-focused. I do hope you'll find time for a family. A woman's most important job is being a mother, after all. I'd nearly choked on my coffee. Well, I believe a woman can have both a career and a family, I'd replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Jane's eyes had narrowed. How modern of you. The tension in the room had been palpable. George, bless him, had tried to change the subject, but Jane wasn't done. And what exactly do your parents think of your ambitions? She'd asked, her voice dripping with disdain. I'd straightened my spine, meeting her gaze. My parents are proud of me. They've always encouraged me to follow my dreams. Jane had sniffed. I see. Well, I suppose not everyone values tradition these days. The memory faded, and I found myself back in the present, anger bubbling in my chest. She hated me from the start, Matthew, I said, my voice tight. And now she's trying to poison us, literally. Matthew ran a hand through his hair, his face a mask of anguish. I know, but what can we do? She's my mother. I stood up, pacing the room. We need to confront her, make her understand that her behavior is unacceptable. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Stay away from my son, you gold-digging harlot, or else. I showed the message to Matthew, watching the color drain from his face. This has gone too far, he muttered, pulling out his own phone. I'm calling her right now. As Matthew dialed, the doorbell rang. We exchanged a wary glance. I'll get it, I said, moving towards the door. I opened it to find Jane standing there, a saccharine smile on her face and a casserole dish in her hands. Surprise, she chirped. I thought I'd drop by with a little home-cooked meal. You two must be so busy with your careers, you probably don't have time for proper nutrition. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Behind me, I could hear Matthew's voice rising as he argued with someone on the phone. Jane's eyes narrowed. Aren't you going to invite me in, dear? I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. Jane, I don't think. Mom, Matthew appeared behind me, his face a storm of emotions. What are you doing here? Jane's smile never wavered. Just bringing my favorite couple a little treat. Won't you let me in? I glanced at the casserole dish, remembering the tainted cake. My stomach churned. Actually, Jane, I said, finding my voice at last. We need to talk about boundaries, respect, and your recent actions. Jane's smile faltered for a moment before returning, brighter and more menacing than ever. Oh, Ava, she purred, pushing past me into the house. I think it's high time we had a little chat, indeed. As the door closed behind her, I caught Matthew's eye. The look we shared was clear. This confrontation was long overdue, and there was no telling how it would end. I never thought I'd dread checking my mailbox, but here I was, heart pounding as I reached for the stack of envelopes. Bills, junk mail, and there it was, another pink envelope reeking of Jane's cloying perfume. With trembling hands, I tore it open. Inside was a cutesy card with kittens on the front. The message inside made my blood run cold. Tick-tock, dear. Your biological clock is running out. Matthew deserves a real family. I crumpled the card, fury rising in my chest. This was the third one this week. Jane's campaign of psychological warfare was relentless. As I stormed back to the house, I nearly collided with our neighbor, Mrs. Simmons. Oh, Ava, she exclaimed, her eyes narrowing. I was just coming to see you. I forced a smile. Hi, Mrs. Simmons. What can I do for you? She pursed her lips. Well, I couldn't help but notice that poor Jane has been looking after your garden lately. It's so kind of her, considering her health issues. I blinked, confused. I'm sorry, what? Mrs. Simmons tutted. Don't play dumb, dear. Jane told us all about how you've been neglecting her, refusing to help with her doctor's appointments, and ignoring her calls. It's shameful, really, she declared. My jaw dropped. That's not true at all. Jane has been. Save your excuses, Mrs. Simmons cut me off. We all know the truth. You're too wrapped up in your career to care about family. No wonder you haven't given Matthew children yet. She turned on her heel and marched away, leaving me stunned and humiliated on my own doorstep. Inside, I found Matthew at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Matt, I said softly, what's wrong? He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. My boss called. Apparently, someone's been sending anonymous emails to the company claiming I'm unstable and unfit for my position. They're considering letting me go. My heart sank. Oh, Matt, I'm so sorry. Do you think? He nodded grimly. It has to be her. Who else would do this? I sank into the chair beside him, my mind reeling. She's destroying our lives, Matt. The neighbors think I'm neglecting her. She's trying to get you fired. What's next? Matthew reached for my hand. We need to confront her together. This has to stop. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Check your email, sweetheart. You might find something interesting. With a sense of dread, I opened my inbox. There, in bold letters, was a message from my company's HR department regarding your resignation. No, I whispered, my voice breaking. She didn't. Matthew peered over my shoulder, his face darkening. She faked your resignation. That's it. We're going over there right now. As we grabbed our keys and headed for the door, it burst open. There stood Jane, her face a mask of concern. "Oh, my dears," she cried. "I came as soon as I heard. Ava, losing your job like that, and Matthew, those terrible rumors at work. You poor things must be devastated." I stared at her, speechless with rage. How dare she stand there pretending to care when she was the cause of all this misery? Matthew stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Cut the act, Mom. We know what you've been doing." Jane's eyes widened in feigned innocence. "What on earth do you mean, sweetheart? I'm only here to help." "Help?" I exploded. "You call this helping? You've been trying to ruin our lives." Jane's facade cracked for a moment, a flash of malice in her eyes. "I'm only doing what's best for my son. He deserves better than you." The tension in the room was palpable. Matthew stood between us, torn between the woman he loved and the mother who raised him. "Enough," he said finally. "This ends now. We're going to sit down and hash this out once and for all." As we moved to the living room, the air thick with unspoken accusations, I couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation would change everything. For better or worse, our family would never be the same after today. The Christmas tree lights twinkled mockingly as I stood in the corner of Jane and George's living room, clutching my glass of wine like a lifeline. The annual family gathering had barely begun, and already I felt like I was suffocating. "More eggnog, anyone?" Jane's saccharine voice cut through the forced cheer, her eyes locked onto mine with a predatory gleam. "Ava dear, you're not drinking. Surely you're not expecting." The room fell silent. I felt the weight of everyone's stares, especially Matthew's. We'd been trying for a baby for months with no success. It was a sore point, one Jane loved to prod. "No, Jane," I said, my voice tight, "just watching my alcohol intake." "Such a shame," she continued. "You know, at your age, every month counts, tick-tock, as they say." I saw Matthew tense, ready to intervene, but I shook my head slightly. I wouldn't let her bait me, not today. As the evening wore on, Jane's barbs became sharper, more frequent. She regaled the family with stories of Matthew's childhood, pointedly mentioning how she'd given up her career to raise him. "Of course some women prefer their jobs to family," she said, her gaze boring into me. "I suppose that's why some never become mothers." That was it. I slammed my glass down, wine sloshing over the rim. "Enough, Jane. Just say what you really mean." The room went deadly quiet. Jane's eyes widened in fox innocence. "Whatever do you mean, Ava? You think I'm a failure as a wife because I work, because I haven't given you grandchildren yet? Well, guess what? My worth isn't determined by my ability to procreate." Jane's mask slipped, revealing the spite beneath. "No, your worth is determined by how you treat family, and you, my dear, are sorely lacking." "Mom," Matthew interjected, but Jane was on a roll. "You've torn this family apart," she hissed, "with your selfish career ambitions and your inability to give Matthew children. He deserves better." I felt like I'd been slapped. Tears pricked my eyes as I looked around the room. George stared at his feet, avoiding conflict as usual. Matthew's cousins whispered among themselves, and Matthew just stood there frozen. In that moment, I'd never felt more alone. "You want to know why we don't have kids yet, Jane?" I said, my voice shaking. "Because every doctor we've seen says the stress in our lives is affecting our fertility. And you know what the biggest source of that stress is? You." Gasps echoed around the room. Jane's face turned an alarming shade of red. "How dare you blame me for your shortcomings?" To confront her, ChatGPT, she shrieked, "Matthew, are you going to let her speak to me like this?" All eyes turned to Matthew. This was it, the moment he had to choose, his wife or his mother. But Matthew remained silent, his face a mask of anguish. And in his silence, I heard everything I needed to know. "Merry Christmas, everyone," I said quietly, grabbing my coat. "I think it's best if I go." As I walked out into the cold night air, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, half hoping to see Matthew. Instead, it was George. "Ava, wait," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm so sorry. What Jane said. It wasn't right." I smiled sably. "But you didn't stop her, did you, George? None of you ever do." He looked away, shame written across his face. "You're right, and that needs to change." As I drove home alone, tears streaming down my face, I realized something had to give. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between my love for Matthew and the toxicity of his family. It was time to make a choice, and as the Christmas lights faded in my rearview mirror, I knew exactly what I had to do. I sat on our living room couch, staring at the packed suitcase by the door. 3 days had passed since the Christmas disaster, and Matthew still hadn't come home. My phone buzzed, another text from him. "I'm sorry, I need more time." More time for what? To choose between his wife and his mother? The thought made my stomach churn. A knock at the door startled me. I opened it, half expecting to see Matthew. Instead, I found myself face to face with George. "Ava," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "May I come in?" I nodded, stepping aside. George entered, his eyes landing on my suitcase. "You're leaving?" he asked, alarm evident in his tone. I shrugged, fighting back tears. "I don't know, maybe. I can't keep living like this, George." He sighed, sinking into an armchair. "I understand, and that's why I'm here. It's time we talked about Jane." My heart raced. Was this another ambush? But George's next words shocked me to my core. "I'm leaving her, Ava. I filed for divorce." I gaped at him, struggling to process this information. "What? But why now?" George's eyes met mine, filled with remorse and determination. "Because I've been a coward for far too long. What Jane did at Christmas was the last straw. I've enabled her behavior for years, and it stops now." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notebook. "I've been keeping track of Jane's episodes, the lies, the manipulation, everything. I thought maybe if I documented it, I'd find the courage to confront her." I took the notebook from him, flipping through the pages filled with dates and detailed accounts of Jane's actions. "George, it's the truth, Ava," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have stood up to her years ago, but I was too afraid. I'm so sorry for everything she's put you through." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you, George. This means more than you know." He reached out, squeezing my hand. "You're a good person, Ava. You deserve better than this. And so does Matthew." As George left, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of the end of Jane's reign of terror. Maybe, just maybe, we could all find some peace. Later that evening, I sat down with my phone, my heart heavy with uncertainty. I needed to talk to Matthew to tell him everything George had said. But as I dialed his number, the door creaked open and Matthew walked in, looking exhausted. "Ava," he said, his voice soft and full of regret. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do." I stood up, walking over to him. "Matt, we need to talk." George was here. He filed for divorce from Jane. Matthew's eyes widened in shock. "He did?" I nodded, holding up the notebook. "He's been documenting everything. The lies, the manipulation, all of it. He wants to make things right." Matthew sank into the couch, his head in his hands. I can't believe it. After all these years, I sat down beside him, taking his hand. "Matt, we can't keep living like this. I love you, but something has to change. We need to stand up to her together." But I never did, until now. As George flipped through the pages, recounting incident after incident, I felt a mix of vindication and horror. Jane's toxicity ran deeper than I ever imagined. "Does Matthew know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. George shook his head. "Not yet. I wanted to tell you first, to apologize for not standing up for you sooner, and to ask for your help." "My help?" "Yes, Matthew, he's struggling, Ava. Jane's got her claws in deep. He needs us, both of us, to show him the truth." Just then, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Matthew. "I'm coming home. We need to talk." I showed George the message, my heart pounding. "He's on his way." George stood, determination etched on his face. "Good. It's time we face this as a family, a real family." As we waited for Matthew, I felt a strange mix of hope and fear. Could this be the turning point we needed? The sound of a key in the lock made us both turn. Matthew walked in, his eyes widening at the sight of his father. "Dad, what are you doing here?" George stepped forward, placing a hand on Matthew's shoulder. "Son, we need to talk about your mother." Matthew's face hardened. "If you're here to defend her—" "No," George interrupted. "I'm here to tell you the truth. All of it." For the next hour, George laid it all out. Years of manipulation, lies, and toxic behavior. Matthew listened in stunned silence, his face a storm of emotions. When George finished, Matthew turned to me, his eyes brimmy with tears. Ava, I'm so sorry. I had no idea it was this bad. I took his hand, squeezing it gently. It's not your fault, Matt, but we can't go on like this. We have to make a choice. Matthew nodded, a new resolve in his eyes. You're right, both of you are. It's time we stood up to Mom together. As the three of us sat there planning our next move, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be tough, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone in this fight. George cleared his throat. There's one more thing you both should know. I've decided to divorce Jane. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. This was it, the point of no return. Whatever happened next would change our family forever. I looked at Matthew, seeing the same mix of fear and determination in his eyes that I felt. We were at a crossroads, and the path we chose would define our future. So I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. What do we do now? The courthouse loomed before us, a monolithic symbol of the battle we were about to face. George's hand trembled as he clutched the divorce papers, his face a mix of determination and fear. Matthew stood beside him, jaw clenched, while I hovered nearby, my heart racing. Are you sure about this, Dad? Matthew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. George nodded, his eyes steely. It's time, son. We can't let her toxicity poison our lives any longer. As we climbed the steps, a familiar voice rang out behind us. Well, what a touching family outing. We turned to see Jane, her lips curved in a cruel smile. She was impeccably dressed as always, but there was a wild look in her eyes that sent chills down my spine. Mom, Matthew started, but Jane cut him off with a wave of her hand. Save it, she spat. I know what this is. You're all conspiring against me. My own family, turning their backs on me. George stepped forward, his voice steady. Jane, this isn't a conspiracy. It's the consequence of your actions. We're here to file for divorce. Jane's face contorted with rage. Divorce? You can't divorce me. I've given you everything, my youth, my dreams, my life. And you've taken just as much from us, I found myself saying, surprising even myself with my boldness. Jane's eyes locked onto mine, blazing with hatred. You, she hissed, this is all your fault. You've poisoned them against me. Before I could react, Jane lunged at me, her manicured nails raking across my face. I stumbled backward, shocked by the sudden attack. Matthew jumped between us, restraining his mother as she thrashed and screamed. Let go of me. She's ruined everything. Our family, our lives. Security guards rushed over, pulling Jane away. As they escorted her off, she turned back, her face a mask of venom. This isn't over, she snarled. I'll destroy you all for this betrayal. Inside the courthouse, we sat in stunned silence, waiting for our turn to file the papers. My cheeks stung where Jane had scratched me, a physical reminder of the emotional wounds she'd inflicted over the years. I'm so sorry, Ava, Matthew murmured gently, touching my face. I never thought she'd. God, what have we done? I took his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. We're doing what's right, Matt. It's not easy, but it's necessary. George nodded, his face ashen. I should have done this years ago. Maybe then. He trailed off, but we all knew what he meant. Maybe then things wouldn't have gotten this bad. Maybe we could have salvaged some semblance of a normal family. As we waited, my phone buzzed incessantly. Messages flooded in from friends, neighbors, even colleagues. Jane had wasted no time spreading her version of events, telling everyone that we had you committed, George. I scrolled through the messages, accusations that we were trying to steal your assets and destroy your reputation. George's face fell. Of course she is. It's always been about control with Jane. If she can't have it, she'll burn everything to the ground. Just then, Matthew's phone rang. He answered, his face growing paler by the second. It's my boss, he whispered, covering the mouthpiece. Jane's called the company, claiming I'm having a mental breakdown and need to be placed on leave. I felt the walls closing in. Jane's web of lies and manipulation was spreading, threatening to unravel everything we'd worked for. Our careers, our reputations, our very lives were hanging in the balance. As Matthew argued with his boss, trying to explain the situation, I caught George's eye. The same thought passed between us. How far would Jane go in her quest for revenge? And more importantly, how could we stop her before she destroyed everything we held dear? The court clerk called our name, jolting us back to reality. This was it, the point of no return. As we stood to follow her into the judge's chambers, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a war we might not be prepared to fight. The aftermath of George's divorce filing was like a tornado tearing through our lives. Jane's venomous lies spread through the community like wildfire, leaving destruction in their wake. I stood on our front porch, watching as yet another neighbor hurried past, averting their eyes. The isolation was suffocating. George's voice called from inside. "You need to see this." I rushed back in to find George and Matthew huddled around a laptop. On the screen was a local community forum, ablaze with posts about us. "She's telling everyone I'm abusive," Matthew said, his voice cracking. "That I've been manipulating Dad into the divorce, that we're after his money." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. This is insane. We have to do something. George nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "I've been making some calls. It's time we fought back." Over the next few days, George became a man possessed. He went door to door, speaking to neighbors and showing them his notebook of Jane's misdeeds. I watched in awe as he transformed from the passive man I'd known into a fierce defender of the truth. But Jane wasn't going down without a fight. As George made headway with the neighbors, she upped her game. Suddenly, she was everywhere. At the grocery store, the park, even outside my office, always playing the part of the frail, wronged woman. "Did you see her at the pharmacy?" Mrs. Simmons cornered me one afternoon. Poor dear could barely walk. "Are you sure you're not being too harsh on her?" I bit back a scream of frustration. "Mrs. Simmons, it's all an act. Jane is." Now, she cut me off. "I know you're going through a rough patch, but let's not say things we can't take back." As Mrs. Simmons walked away, I felt the walls closing in. How could we fight an enemy who wielded sympathy as a weapon? The answer came in an unexpected form. One evening, as we sat around our dining table plotting our next move, a knock at the door interrupted us. Jane's phone buzzed. "It's Dr. Patel," George said, frowning. "Jane's doctor." We listened in stunned silence as George spoke to the doctor. When he hung up, his face was a mix of triumph and disgust. "Jane's been faking her health issues," he said. "Dr. Patel has been suspicious for a while and is willing to testify that there's nothing physically wrong with her." It was the break we needed. Armed with this information, we launched a counter-offensive. George spoke to the local paper, sharing his story and the truth about Jane's deception. Matthew reached out to his company, explaining the situation with Dr. Patel's statement backing him. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Neighbors who had shunned us started to reach out, offering apologies and support. Jane's web of lies began to unravel. But just as we thought we were gaining ground, disaster struck. I woke up one morning to find our front yard filled with news vans and reporters. "Ava," Matthew called from the living room. "You need to see this." On the TV, Jane stood before a sea of microphones, tears streaming down her face. "My own family," she sobbed. "They've turned against me all because I dared to speak the truth about their greed and manipulation." My heart sank as I watched the sympathetic nods of the reporters. Jane had taken her performance to a national stage. As the doorbell began to ring incessantly with reporters clamoring for our side of the story, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. How could we possibly fight this? Our private family drama had become a public spectacle, and Jane was playing the role of the victim to perfection. Matthew turned to me, his face pale. "What do we do now?" I looked from him to George, both men looking more defeated than I'd ever seen them. This was it, the moment that would define our future. We could either crumble under the pressure or stand up and fight. Taking a deep breath, I squared my shoulders. "We tell our story," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "All of it. No more hiding, no more shame. It's time the world knew the truth about Jane." As I reached for the door, ready to face the media storm outside, I silently prayed we were making the right choice. Because if this didn't work, we'd be giving Jane exactly what she wanted, our complete and utter destruction. The courtroom fell silent as Jane took the stand, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. I gripped Matthew's hand tightly, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. "Mrs. Thompson," our lawyer began, "can you explain why you've been spreading false information about your family?" Jane's eyes welled with tears. "I've only ever told the truth. My family has abandoned me, left me to suffer alone." I felt a surge of anger, But before I could react, our lawyer produced a familiar notebook, George's meticulous record of Jane's behavior. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to present evidence of Mrs. Thompson's long history of manipulation and deceit." As our lawyer read excerpt after damning excerpt, I watched Jane's facade crumble. Her eyes darted around the courtroom, searching for sympathy but finding none. Then came the coup de grace. Dr. Patel's testimony. He calmly explained how Jane had fabricated her health issues, using them to garner sympathy and control her family. In my professional opinion, Dr. Patel concluded, Mrs. Thompson is in perfect health. Her claims of debilitating illness are entirely false. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jane's face contorted with rage, her mask finally slipping completely. "You ungrateful wretches," she shrieked, pointing at us. "After everything I've done for you?" As security restrained her, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The truth was out, and Jane could no longer hide behind her lies. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Jane was ordered to cease all contact with us, and George's divorce was finalized. As we left the courthouse, a crowd of reporters waited. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," one called out, "how do you feel about the verdict?" I looked at Matthew and George, seeing my own mix of relief and sadness mirrored in their eyes. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward. "We're relieved that the truth has come to light," I said, my voice steady. "But more than that, we're hopeful that we can now move forward and heal as a family." In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to normal. Our neighbors, once wary, now greeted us warmly. Matthew's company, satisfied with the court's findings, welcomed him back with open arms. But the biggest surprise came on a quiet Sunday morning. As Matthew and I sat at the breakfast table, I felt a sudden wave of nausea. "Ava," Matthew's voice was concerned, "are you okay?" I looked up at him, a smile spreading across my face as realization dawned. "Matthew, I think I'm pregnant." The joy that filled our home that day was indescribable. When we shared the news with George, his eyes filled with happy tears. "Life finds a way," he said, hugging us both, even in the darkest times. As I stood there surrounded by the love of my family, I realized something profound. The ordeal with Jane, as painful as it had been, had made us stronger. We had faced the storm together and come out the other side, battered but unbroken. Months later, as I held our newborn daughter in my arms with Matthew and George by my side, I felt a sense of peace I'd never known before. We had weathered the worst and emerged victorious, not just over Jane's toxicity, but over the fear and doubt that had plagued us for so long. "Welcome to the world, little one," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "You're born into a family that knows the true meaning of love and loyalty." Matthew squeezed my shoulder, his eyes shining with pride and love. "We've come so far," he murmured. George nodded, gently touching his granddaughter's cheek. "And we have so much to look forward to." As I gazed at my daughter's innocent face, I made a silent promise. She would grow up knowing only love and support, free from the toxic influences that had nearly torn us apart. We had broken the cycle and in doing so, given her the greatest gift of all, a family built on trust, respect, and unconditional love. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but I knew we could face anything as long as we stood together. We had weathered the storm, and now, at last, we could bask in the sunlight of a brighter tomorrow. "More champagne, Mom?" Julian asked, refilling my glass before I could respond. I smiled hesitantly, nervously glancing at my son and his fiancée. We were celebrating their recent engagement with an intimate family dinner, though an unsettled feeling stirred in my gut. "To your happiness," Sienna purred, clinking her glass against mine. I nodded and took a generous sip. "There's something we wanted to discuss with you tonight," Julian said, exchanging a sly glance with Sienna. "We're planning a huge engagement party next month. Only the best for our perfect union." I chuckled anxiously. "How wonderful for you both, but those parties can get quite pricey, can't they?" "Oh, we're not paying a thing," Sienna said with a wave of her hand. "That's going to be your gift to us." I nearly choked on my champagne. "I'm sorry." "As Julian's mother, it's your duty to pay," Sienna continued. "We expect you to contribute at least $25,000. Consider it an investment in your son's future." They couldn't be serious. $25,000 for a party, I said incredulously. "Do you have any idea how unreasonable?" "Don't be ridiculous, Mom," Julian interrupted. You make good money, and you have all the inheritance money from Dad you've been hoarding. My husband's recent death after battling cancer was still an open wound. I recoiled at their callous remarks. That money is my nest egg for retirement, and to pay these expenses without even consulting me first. Sienna rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, still harping on about being consulted. Get over yourself already. You're the mother of the groom. This is what's expected. Shell out the cash and be grateful we're letting you contribute at all. You should feel honored we're even inviting you. Julian sneered. So write the damn check so we can start planning. I sat stunned, unable to comprehend their arrogance and disregard. I appealed once more to my son. Honey, be reasonable. You can have a lovely party without extravagant costs. Let's scale things back a bit. Julian slammed his fist on the table, rattling the glasses. I knew you would pull this cheapskate crap, he shouted. Some mother you are, can't even support your only son. Hot tears sprang to my eyes as I took in their contemptuous glares. Perhaps I had spoiled my son rotten over the years, but I never imagined he could treat me with such cruelty and disrespect. I stood abruptly, disgusted by the two vipers lounging in my home. I think you should leave now, I said quietly. Sienna leaped up and gripped my shoulders with sharp red nails. Don't even try rejecting your duty, she growled, her perfumed breath assaulting my nostrils. You either pay up, or you can kiss your relationship with Julian and any future grandchildren goodbye. I shook her off violently. Get out, I bellowed. Out of my house this instant. They stalked out without another word, but I saw them exchange a triumphant smirk. My heart dropped, realizing the engagement celebration I had hoped for would instead deliver nothing but greed, manipulation, and pain. The next evening, tired from a long day at work, but determined to settle the conflict, I prepared a simple pasta dinner, hoping to have an open discussion with Julian. I heard the front door slam and braced myself as loud footsteps echoed down the hall. Something smells good. Julian breezed into the kitchen and headed straight for the wine cabinet. My hopes lifted for a moment, then quickly faded as Sienna clip-clopped in behind him, reeking of heavy perfume. So much for a private chat with my son. To what do I owe the pleasure? I asked dryly, draining the pasta. You're going to love what we have planned, Sienna gushed, ignoring my tone as she rifled through her tacky designer handbag. We met with the wedding coordinator today, and everything is set. All we need is one little thing from you. She flourished a folder stuffed with brochures and invoices. Just sign on the dotted line for the $50,000 wedding package. I froze, a chill running down my spine. $50,000? I gasped. For a single-day celebration, that's outrageous. It's our special day, Julian whined. Don't I deserve the very best? I appealed to his conscience. Son, be reasonable. Let's scale back and have an intimate, meaningful ceremony instead of this circus. Sienna slammed the folder down. You incompetent hag. Who said this was open for discussion? She screeched. You will pay every penny to give your only son his dream wedding. Rage boiled up inside of me. Through gritted teeth, I replied, you entitled, nasty piece off. Mom, stop. We all turned in surprise to see my daughter, Harper, standing firmly in the archway. I had been so focused on the confrontation I hadn't even heard her come in. Stay out of this, dyke, Sienna snarled at my heavily tattooed, alternative graphic novelist daughter. It doesn't concern you. The hell it doesn't, Harper retorted. You don't talk that way to my mother. She crossed the room to stand protectively beside me. Under normal circumstances, I might have bristled at her interference, always trying to be the strong, independent matriarch. But at that moment, her solidarity was a lifeline, and I welcomed it. Julian threw his hands up melodramatically. I asked for one little wedding, and my entire family turns against me. He pointed an accusing finger at his sister. This is all your influence, filling Mom's head with delusions. She owes me this money and her loyalty. Harper folded her arms. Mom owes you nothing but basic respect, which clearly isn't reciprocated. She raised you single-handedly after Dad died, working tirelessly to give you every advantage. And this is how you repay decades of love and generosity with shameless exploitation. My ingrained son had no response other than childish whimpers. Harper turned to me, her tattooed hand gripping mine firmly. You stand strong, Mom. Set boundaries and demand the respect you deserve. I've got your back. The knot in my chest loosened with immense relief. My daughter's stalwart support washed away my self-doubts. I would not bow down to these greedy, manipulative vultures for another minute. I drew myself up to full height, emboldened. You both have two choices, I addressed Julian and Sienna in a loud, clear voice. Treat me and my daughter with basic decency, or get the hell out of our lives. Sienna opened her mouth, no doubt to spew more bile. But she caught Harper's murderous glare, thought better of it, and dragged a whimpering Julian out by his ear instead. I squeezed Harper's hand, my eyes brimming with grateful tears. However did I get so lucky to have a daughter like you? She smiled crookedly, just being a chip off the old block. Now let's dish up that pasta and plot our next move. These asshats don't know who they're messing with. The next week crawled by in intense uncertainty. My phone buzzed incessantly with demanding texts and voicemails from Julian, raging when I didn't immediately call him back. I started screening my calls, not having the energy to deal with his abusive diatribes. When Saturday afternoon came, I decided to treat myself to a manicure to lift my spirits. As I sat relaxing while the technician groomed my nails, my phone buzzed yet again. Normally, I would ignore it, but glancing down, I saw it was a call from Julian's number. Curiosity got the best of me. "Hi, honey," I answered cautiously. "It's your witch of a mother," came Sienna's grating voice instead. My blood instantly started boiling. I was just about to hang up when I heard Julian's sneering tones in the background. "Is the old bag actually taking your call? She's been dodging mine all week." There was a rustling sound, followed by his voice coming clearly through the phone speaker. "Mom, what the hell? I've been calling nonstop. Have you given any more thought to funding the wedding? The coordinator is breathing down my neck." I opened my mouth to deliver a stern refusal, but Sienna's shrill voice cut me off. "Oh, let it go already. She's clearly a lost cause." There was a slap, as if she swatted his arm. "Your mother is a dried-up, selfish prune. Once we're married, we'll change all the account passwords so she can never access our money." My eyes nearly popped out of my skull. "Our money." There was more rustling. Then Sienna's grating voice continued. "Why are we even still inviting her to the wedding? She'll just show up wearing some raggedy outfit from the clearance rack at TJ Maxx." Their raucous laughter boiled my blood, but worse was Julian's reply. "Right? God, and you know she's going to be all whiny about contributing to our future, as if that puny life insurance payout could compare to what I make in a month." The hair on my neck bristled with outrage. The puny payout was nearly $500,000 that I had invested for retirement, not blown on sports cars and designer clothes like my prodigal son. Sienna scoffed loudly. "Oh please, we both know it was your daddy's money that set you up nicely at that firm. Your mother couldn't manage an allowance without a man's help." "Hell yes to that," Julian cackled. "And we put that inheritance money to way better use, like annual trips to Dubai. First class all the way." Their uproarious laughter made my blood boil. I stabbed the red phone icon with so much force I nearly cracked the screen. Those money-grubbing snakes. I had suspected their motive all along, but hearing their vile words firsthand rocked me to the core. My hands trembled with rage and indignation. I waved away the technician's concerned glances, threw a wad of cash on the counter, and raced for the door. I drove home in record time, burning up with the need to unload to Harper. Thankfully, she was already there waiting, her motorcycle parked haphazardly on the driveway. I burst through the front door, and she leaped up from the couch, startled by my frazzled state. The story came pouring out in an enraged torrent. Harper's green eyes blazed. "Those conniving ___," she yelled. "I knew it all along. It was never about family or celebration. They just see you as a cash dispensary." "I feel so betrayed and used," I said bitterly, choking back tears of frustration. My only son. How could he? Harper gripped my shoulders, her piercing gaze meeting mine. "Mom, listen to me. We need to gather evidence and expose these cockroaches for who they really are." Her fist hit her palm with a decisive whack. "Contact the wedding coordinator. Get documentation of everything they arranged without your consent. I'll dig into Sienna's background too. I guarantee her family is loaded despite those snake oil tears. We're going to shut this whole circus down." Hope and courage surged up in me again. My wonderful daughter was right. The time had come to take control and fight back. I pulled her in for a fierce hug, more grateful than ever for her integrity and strength. "Let's go nail their greedy asses to the wall." Over the next 2 weeks, Harper and I gathered reams of evidence exposing Julian and Sienna's deceit. Harper uncovered that Sienna came from an extremely affluent family who were fully capable of funding their daughter's lavish tastes. Get this, Harper had uncovered on LinkedIn. Her father owns a huge real estate investment firm. He could easily foot the bill for this circus wedding. Meanwhile, I obtained financial records from the wedding coordinator showing the exorbitant expenses Julian and Sienna were trying to rack up on my dime. $75,000 and counting. We have everything we need to confront these swindlers, Harper declared, spreading paperwork across the dining table before us. Let's invite them over to review wedding plans and then drop the hammer on them. Her green eyes glinted with determination. So I extended the bait, luring them over under the pretense of financing, reconciliation, and celebration details. The bait was taken instantly. Right on time, the doorbell screeched urgently. Before I could even answer, Julian and Sienna blew in, reeking as usual of arrogance and channel number 5. Where's my check then? Julian demanded right off the bat. Subtlety had never been his strong suit. Sienna elbowed him sharply, then plastered on a syrupy smile. Yes, do tell us the good news, she trilled. We have so many decisions to finalize for our big day. I gestured for them to take a seat. Under the table, Harper silently slid me the thick manila envelope containing the damning evidence. My heart pounded, but resolve hardened my nerves. I folded my hands tightly on the table. Before we discuss any further arrangements, I have a few concerns to address. I removed the paperwork from the envelope and fanned it out in front of me. According to the wedding coordinator, current expenses total $75,000. Care to explain? Sienna scoffed loudly. It's the wedding of the century. What do you expect? I expect honest communication around finances and shared responsibility. I replied evenly. For example, why don't Sienna's clearly wealthy parents contribute their fair share? After all, I pulled out a copy of her dad's business profile with a net worth in the tens of millions. They could easily afford this. Sienna blanched. Julian sputtered angrily. Leave Sienna's family out of this. My wedding, my financial support, he turned to point a finger at me. And you're my mother, so cut the check. Having expected denial, I calmly slid over the pile of invoices and contracts. Actually, these documents prove otherwise. They have my forged signature authorizing non-refundable down payments totaling $155,000 so far. Care to explain that? Sienna gasped dramatically. Are you accusing us of fraud? From beside me, Harper suddenly slammed down an authoritative fist. Damn straight she is. My daughter's unexpected bellows stunned them into momentary silence. Harper seized the opportunity to append the rest of the manila envelope's contents across the table. Bank statements, screenshots, and phone records, irrefutable evidence of their lies and manipulation, scattered dramatically before us. It's all here in black and white, Harper spat with unrestrained disgust. You snakes have been exploiting my mother's love and trust this whole time, never giving a damn about family bonds, just what you can swindle out of her. You were spying on us? Julian spluttered in outrage. Gathering evidence against your fraud, I corrected icily. And now that everything is laid bare, you will cancel this sham wedding immediately. Sienna shot up out of her chair, nostrils flaring. How dare you, she shrieked. I will be marrying Julian with or without your money. She turned to my son with a pout. Back me up here. But Julian just sat there, pale and trembling, the magnitude of revelations rocking him into stunned silence for once. The confrontation had rendered him speechless. Sienna rolled her eyes in disgust. You spineless mama's boy. Forget it. She snatched her tacky designer handbag and stormed out, pausing in the doorway to deliver one final venomous glare. You'll regret this, she hissed at me. We won't forget. Then she flounced away in a cloud of Chanel. I stared evenly back at my shaken son. Nor will we, I said quietly. Now leave. He scrambled up hurriedly, but just before exiting, he mumbled a soft but clear threat. I'll make you pay for this. The day I had been dreading arrived. Julian and Sienna's lavish wedding. I had hoped her confrontation would be the end of it, but these stubborn snakes pursued their farce nuptials anyway, blowing through even more of the retirement money I had entrusted to Julian's accounts. So here I sat, an unwilling participant in their twisted matrimonial circus. All around me, intoxicated guests gambled under ostentatious floral arrangements that cost more than my first car. The crowning glory was an 8-tier fondant cake dripping with handcrafted sugar flowers. Julian and Sienna's smug faces towered above it all in a massive golden frame. My daughter Harper slouched next to me, clad in ripped jeans and combat boots, her pixie-cut green hair clashing spectacularly with the pastel bridesmaid dresses. We silently watched the overblown spectacle unfold, barely concealing our disgust. Suddenly, the music transitioned to a bombastic wedding march. The crowd hushed in anticipation as Julian took his place under the altar's garish archway. My heart clenched. He looked so much like his father, tall and dashing in his tuxedo, beaming with charismatic charm. Not a trace remained of the petulant, greedy boy I had confronted just weeks prior. Radiant pride glowed from him as his bride floated down the aisle. Dressed in a frothy designer gown I had no doubt charged to my credit card. Old memories and grief welled up. I had walked that same path over 30 years ago, naive and drunk on dreams of lifelong partnership and family, dreams that soured all too quickly. My faith in love and devotion had died alongside my husband, and now the son we created together slapped me in the face with the same callous disregard. As the ceremony droned on, a righteous rage simmered within me. I could not, bless this loveless union with my presence for another moment. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping loudly across the polished floor. All eyes turned to me. Harper grasped my hand supportively. I cleared my throat, meeting Julian's alarmed gaze. I apologize, but I cannot stay silent about this travesty. My voice rang out loud and clear. Murmurs rippled through the stunned guests. Julian flushed crimson, shrinking under my bold stare. Before he could muster a response, Sienna shoved past him, teeth bared and eyes spitting fury. "How dare you interrupt my perfect day?" She advanced toward me, manicured claws outstretched menacingly. I stepped back, recoiling from her vicious energy. Harper immediately confronted the deranged bride. "Back off," she commanded, her voice like steel. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Harper relied on my sharp business instincts to manage her quickly ballooning finances. At her behest, I leveraged decades of investment experience to establish trademarks, negotiate publishing rights, and maximize profits. I swelled with pride watching my daughter's passions flourish under my careful cultivation. Soon, Harper was regularly turning up in edgy fashion magazines and sought-after graphic anthologies. She purchased a sleek downtown loft as her business base of operations, proudly showcasing the extravagant views she had earned solely through her prodigious talents. To celebrate Harper's rapid rise, I decided to host an intimate gathering of key supporters and collaborators at her swanky new digs. The catered affair would mark her official arrival as an artistic visionary and independent woman of means. Harper greeted guests with an uncharacteristic nervous energy as I directed caterers to artfully arrange free-flowing champagne and delicate canapés. "You have nothing to worry over," I reassured my daughter as I straightened her smart blazer. "Just be your normal captivating self. These people already adore you." Soon the loft overflowed with Harper's avant-garde inner circle. Daring writers, leading publishers, edgy photographers, and even some A-list names from Harper's celebrity clientele. They all made appearances to toast their favorite tattoo visionary. Pride swelled my chest to hear such powerful figures celebrating my exceptionally talented daughter. This was the launch party Julian could only ever fantasize about. 2 short years ago, my family's name was tarnished by greedy failures. Now, through Harper's virtues, respect had not only been restored but elevated to an artistic elite status. Late into the evening, I stepped onto the balcony beside Harper, gazing over vibrant city lights. She squeezed my hand gently. "None of this would be possible without you, Mom. You believed in me when no one else did, invested in me, fought for me. I'll owe you forever." I wrapped one arm around her slim, leather-clad shoulders, champagne flute clutched elegantly in the other hand. "Nonsense, my brave darling. Your soaring success stems solely from your vision and daring talents." I swept one arm across the glimmering skyline before us. "All this you manifested wholly on your own. I merely facilitated the business deals so you could freely create." Harper grinned crookily. "Ah yes, well, I clearly inherited your ruthless business savvy along with Dad's creative spirit." She playfully clinked her glass to mine. "To the dynamic duo, may we always prevail over vipers and thieves." I laughed brightly, heart swelling with maternal joy. My daughter and I had come through the crucible of greed and betrayal to now bask in self-made success. As the lively celebration carried on behind us, I silently offered one final toast upward to her beloved father. We had created a fine legacy after all, one sculpted purely from integrity, courage, and toil instead of entitlement or manipulation. That legacy now towered as a gleaming testament to morality for all the Julians of the world to gaze upon with envy for decades to come. Over the next 2 years, Harper's star continued to ascend in a brilliant, trailblazing trajectory. Meanwhile, I heard through mutual contacts that Julian languished in obscurity and mounting debt. His lavish lifestyle sustained itself for a while on credit before the house of cards inevitably collapsed. The rare times Julian's name surfaced, it was tied to seedy gossip rags and drunken tabloid scandals. From Sienna's very public affair to Julian getting fired from a car dealership for defaulting on payments. Karma seemed intent on grinding my prodigal son into the dirt. I ignored the lurid headlines with a quiet sense of satisfaction, confident I would never lay eyes on him again. By now, I had retired from corporate leadership to focus on passion projects, indulging artistic hobbies, volunteering with disadvantaged youth, and planning leisurely global adventures. I decided it was also time to downsize into a lower-maintenance home. After a prolonged search, I found my perfect oasis, a private bungalow in a picturesque coastal senior community. Mature trees and vibrant gardens welcomed me each morning as I embarked on scenic nature walks with dear widowed friends. The idyllic setting and social kinship brought me a sense of peace I hadn't realized was missing. Meanwhile, Harper had also found her soul's counterpart, a brilliant software developer named Riley who adored her vibrant spirit. I instantly detected true partnership potential upon meeting Riley. My instincts proved correct. Just months after moving in together, Harper excitedly presented me with news of their engagement. I whooped joyfully when she flashed the unique geometric ring Riley had custom designed. "My darling girl," I exclaimed through happy tears, "I'm thrilled you found someone deserving of your tremendous heart." The private garden wedding ceremony Harper described echoed my own intimate vision 3 decades prior. No showy fanfare, just profound lifelong commitment celebrated by cherished community. I clasped Harper's hand, overcome with emotion at how perfectly she was manifesting her father's and my unrealized dreams. Later, during wedding planning over tea and biscuits, Harper hesitated before broaching the subject I knew she would. "Mom, about inviting Julian." I waved one hand briskly. "Let's not sully your special day by entertaining that notion." Harper bit her lip. "I just can't help but pity him, you know. He's clearly a miserable screw-up, but still family, even if he doesn't deserve it. I wonder if including him would be the right thing." She trailed off uncertainly. Recognizing my daughter's enduring compassion even for those who least warranted it, I patted her hand reassuringly. "You needn't ever compromise your kind principles. If some small mercy for Julian eases your mind, I can tolerate his presence just this once." Harper exhaled in relief and squeezed my hand gratefully. "You're the best, Mom. I knew you'd understand." The sentimental moment was sharply interrupted by my ringing cell phone. Glancing down, I was stunned to see Julian's name flash across the screen. Months had passed since his last desperate drunken voicemail pleading for money. Face grim, I silenced the call. "Speak of the devil," I remarked dryly. Harper shook her head. "He never stops trying to worm his way back in. But don't worry, Mom. After the wedding, you'll never have to deal with his garbage again." I smiled gently at my daughter's protective tone. She was right. The time had long passed for me to entertain Julian's self-pitying overtures. I now had all I ever needed right here in my tranquil life, surrounded by those whose souls nurtured mine. No redirects from a toxic past could ever breach that blessing. I patted Harper's hand resolutely. "Onwards and upwards, my dear. Now tell me more about the lovely flower arrangements you envisioned." I smoothed the wrinkles on my silk evening gown and took a deep breath. Tonight's celebration dinner at the country club was supposed to be a joyous occasion, marking my husband Martin's retirement after decades at the helm of Reese Industries. Little did I know it would become the stage for one of the most shocking betrayals of my life. As we clinked champagne glasses with the board members and their spouses, Martin cleared his throat. "I have an announcement to make," he declared, his eyes flickering toward a young woman at the other end of the table. My heart sank as I recognized Ava Carter, one of the junior marketing executives. The way Martin looked at her made my stomach churn. Lillian and I have decided to get divorced, Martin continued, his voice unwavering. I've fallen in love with someone else, and we plan to marry soon. A hush fell over the table as gasps and murmurs erupted. I felt all eyes boring into me, waiting for my reaction. Tears stunned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. You coward, I spat at Martin, my voice trembling with fury. How dare you blindside me like this? I'm sorry, Lillian, he said, not sounding sorry at all. But I've made up my mind. Ava understands me in a way you never could. Ava shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushed. I shot her a withering glare, wondering how this naive girl could be so foolish. As the dinner descended into chaos, I excused myself, desperate for air. Out on the terrace, I leaned against the railing, trying to steady my breathing. Anger and humiliation washed over me in waves. Martin had been my whole world for over 30 years. We'd built Reese Industries together from the ground up, sacrificing countless nights and weekends. And this was how he repaid me, by casting me aside for someone half my age. I wiped away a stray tear, my jaw clenched with determination. If Martin thought I would go down without a fight, he was sorely mistaken. Game on, I thought grimly. The gloves were coming off. I tossed and turned that night, replaying the horror of Martin's betrayal over and over in my mind. How could the man I'd loved and supported for decades do this to me, to our family? As the first rays of dawn peeked through the curtains, I knew I couldn't wallow in misery any longer. If Martin wanted war, then war was what he'd get. I marched into the private bathroom and examined my reflection in the mirror. Though my eyes were puffy from crying, my resolve had never been stronger. I was Lillian Reese, and I would not be the victim here. The first order of business was hiring a bulldog of a divorce attorney. I had my secretary line up meetings with the city's most cutthroat legal eagles. Within a matter of hours, I was sitting across from Jennifer Holder, a ferocious litigator known for devouring wandering husbands. I want to bleed him dry, I stated bluntly as Jennifer flipped through my financial documents. She arched an immaculately groomed eyebrow. Even with your substantial assets, a nasty divorce could deplete your net worth considerably. Money is no object, I said through gritted teeth. That lying snake is going to pay for what he did to me and my family's legacy. A feral grin spread across Jennifer's razor-sharp features. Then let's make sure we take him for everything he's worth. Over the next few weeks, I followed Jennifer's guidance to the letter, marshaling every resource at my disposal. Quiet instructions were issued to Reese Industries' accounting department for a full forensic audit under the guise of routine due diligence. Every bank statement, every money transfer, I wanted them come through with a fine-tooth comb. Jennifer coached me on sowing seeds of doubt among the board members, suggesting personal concerns over Martin's ability to properly steer the company given his emotionally compromised state. A few whispered comments here, a furrowed brow there, and suddenly the company I'd helped build was questioning my husband's leadership. All the while, Martin sauntered around in a loved-up daze, oblivious to the powder keg I was carefully constructing around him. He thought I would simply walk away, that I would be content with whatever crumbs he deemed to toss my way in the divorce. The poor fool had no idea what kind of hell was coming. The forensic audit quickly bore fruit, revealing a tangled web of shady dealings all connected to Martin's desperation to impress his young mistress. Inflated expense reports, kickbacks from vendors, even outright embezzlement. He put Reese Industries' financial health at risk to fund his lavish courtship of Ava. I pored over the damning documents late into the night, my fury growing with each uncovered impropriety. This was the true depth of Martin's deceit. He was willing to sacrifice our life's work, the company we built from nothing, all for a fling with a girl young enough to be his daughter. The next morning, I hand-delivered the audit findings to the board, making sure to linger on the most egregious violations with pointed commentary. Clearly, Martin's judgment has been clouded by his personal indiscretions, I stated, careful to keep my tone measured despite the storm raging inside me. I shudder to think how much further this rot might have spread if left unchecked. One by one, I watched the concern etching itself onto the board members' faces. Even Martin's most ardent supporters couldn't deny the evidence of his mismanagement and potential criminality. Martin, for his part, seemed stunned by my revelations. The fool actually had the audacity to pull me aside and try to plead ignorance. Lillian, you have to believe me, I never meant for things to go this far, he blubbered. I've made some mistakes, sure, but it was all for love. I recoiled from his clammy grasp. disgust written plain across my face. For love? You jeopardized everything we built together for some cheap fling. I don't even recognize you anymore. As is summoned, Ava appeared in the doorway, her overdone makeup unable to mask the fragility beneath. Martin's eyes immediately locked onto her, his entire stance changing as if their bond transcended the tawdry reality. "Don't worry, my dear," he cooed. "Once the old ball and chain is out of the way, nothing will keep us apart." The naked cruelty in his voice awakened an icy clarity in me. Forget taking him for everything he was worth. This man deserved to lose it all. I crossed the room and stood squarely between Martin and his prize. "Let me make one thing clear to both of you. I am not going anywhere. This company was my lifelong endeavor long before you came along, Ava, and I'll be damned if I let either of you destroy it with your recklessness." Ava opened her mouth, her panicked eyes flicking to Martin for support, but I cut her off with a sharp gesture. "As for you," I turned my withering gaze onto my soon-to-be ex-husband. "I did not survive decades of your insufferable ego just to be discarded in your twilight years. You want to play in the mud with this girl? Be my guest, but I guarantee the only thing awaiting you is regret." Turning on my heel, I left them gaping in my wake, already planning my next salvo. Let them have their fantasy for now. Their world was about to come crashing down. With the audit findings laying bare Martin's misdeeds, I knew I held all the leverage for ensuring a favorable divorce settlement. Still, I intended to twist the knife further before going in for the kill. I requested an emergency meeting with Martin, putting on my best act of contriteness when he arrived. "I've had some time to reflect on things," I began, wringing my hands for effect, "and I realize now how terribly I've behaved." Martin's eyes widened in surprise, and I fought back the urge to sneer at his gullibility. "Really? You're finally coming around." "I was just so hurt and angry," I continued, letting my voice quaver with manufactured regret. "But I see now that I can't force you to love me. You found happiness with Ava, and it's not my place to stand in the way of true love." The smug satisfaction oozing from his expression was almost too much to bear. "Well, I'm glad you've come to your senses. This has been difficult enough without your vindictiveness making things worse." I reached across the table and grasped his hand, putting on my best pleading expression. "I only want what's best for you, Martin, which is why you have to end this affair immediately." His brow furrowed in confusion. "What? Why would I do that?" Leaning in, I lowered my voice conspiratorially. "Because I'm afraid Ava has been using you this whole time, taking advantage of your generous nature for her own gain." Martin opened his mouth to protest, but I barreled on with my carefully constructed narrative. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I've discovered evidence that she's been having other affairs. Multiple affairs, Martin. She's been bleeding you dry to fund her indiscretions behind your back." His face cycled through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Anger, hurt, disbelief. "No, Ava would never. We love each other." Putting on my most sorrowful expression, I gave his hand a pat. "I'm so sorry, but it's true. The bank records, the money transfers, it's all there in black and white. She's been making a fool of you." Martin's shoulders slumped in defeat. For just an instant, I felt a pang of something, pity perhaps. It quickly passed as I recalled all the anguish he put me through. If it's any consolation, this newfound wisdom has made me realize how deeply I've misjudged you over the years. I lied through my teeth. Why, if I had a partner who showed half the care and steadfast dedication you've displayed, I would consider myself the luckiest woman alive. That seemed to bolster Martin's spirit somewhat as he mumbled a thank you. Men were so easy to manipulate once you mastered their fragile egos. As he lumbered out, I allowed myself a satisfied smile. Between the gaping financial void awaiting him and the carefully planted seeds of doubt about his precious Ava's fidelity, Martin's world was crumbling all around him. Just a few more shoves, and the whole pathetic facade would come crashing down in delicious ruin. With Martin reeling from my revelations about Ava's supposed infidelity, it was time to go for the kill shot. I convened an emergency board meeting, putting on my most solemn expression as the members filed in. "I'm afraid I have some deeply troubling news regarding Martin's conduct as CEO." I began once everyone was seated. "It pains me to have to do this, but the evidence leaves me no choice." I nodded to my assistant, who distributed the damning audit findings, letting the weight of the financials speak for themselves. Audible gasps and murmurs rippled through the room as they digested the extent of the embezzlement and misappropriation. As you can see, Martin has been systematically looting the company's coffers, all to fund an utterly unacceptable personal relationship, I declared, letting the accusation hang heavy in the air. His judgment has been hopelessly compromised to a degree that constitutes gross dereliction of duty. Walter Grimes, one of the senior board members known for his unshakable ethics, set down the report with a look of profound disappointment. I had my suspicions, given the rumors, but I never imagined the depths of Martin's betrayal. This is a gut punch. Believe me, Walter, I understand your pain all too well, I replied, putting on my most mournful expression. Which is why, as difficult as it is, I feel we have no choice but to relieve Martin of his duties, effective immediately. A chorus of solemn nods rippled through the room. Even those typically loyal to Martin seemed unable to overlook his staggering lapses. Gritting my teeth, I forced out my next words. It truly breaks my heart to say this, but Martin's personal indiscretions appear to have sent him into an emotional tailspin, calling into question his fitness to lead this company. For the good of Reese Industries and our employees, I recommend an indefinite leave of absence on medical grounds while he seeks treatment. The cowed reactions told me they had taken the bait by portraying Martin's ouster as a compassionate intervention rather than a straight termination. I had given them all plausible deniability to avoid feeling complicit in his downfall. As the meeting adjourned with the board's full endorsement, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Everything was falling into place perfectly. The forensics, the sowing of doubts, and now this coup de grace. A part of me felt a flicker of sadness at how far my beloved husband had fallen. But he had chosen to throw away the life we built together through his arrogance and weakness. I merely ensured he suffered the full consequences. My reverie was interrupted by the ping of a new email from Jennifer, my attorney. Pulling up the message, I scanned her concise update and felt a rush of vicious satisfaction. Transfer of assets proceeding as planned. The financial guillotine is primed. Just say the word. I typed a simple reply. Do it. Let the delicious ruination begin. The dominoes began falling into place with ruthless precision. Within days of being forced into a leave of absence, Martin found himself being systematically frozen out of Reese Industries operations. Emails went unanswered, meetings rescheduled, until he was essentially a ghost presence at the company he had once lorded over. I could only imagine the sinking feeling in the pit of his gut as the power he had taken for granted for decades slipped through his fingers. Still, I knew the worst was yet to come for the arrogant fool. Ms. Reese, you have a visitor. My assistant's voice crackled over the intercom. Ava Carter is asking to see you. A cruel smile tugged at my lips as I buzzed her in. The girl's arrival was right on schedule. Ava entered, looking every bit the rabbit caught in the headlights. Though she tried valiantly to maintain her polished composure, I could see the cracks spider webbing beneath the surface. What can I do for you, dear? I asked in my most saccharine tone as she took a seat. I trust this isn't about your extracurricular activities with Martin. I would simply hate for word of that unpleasantness to spread further. Her eyes went wide with panic. What are you talking about? Oh, I'm sure it's nothing. I waved a perfectly manicured hand in feigned nonchalance. Just that it would be an awful shame if those private investigator reports detailing your numerous other affairs ended up going public. Can you imagine the scandal? Ava paled, and I fought back the urge to cackle at her obvious distress. The phony dossier I had concocted was truly a work of art. But that's not true, she sputtered. Martin and we love each other. It's just us. If you say so, dear, I replied coolly. Though if I were you, I might be more concerned with his mounting legal troubles and the likelihood of financial ruin. That caught her attention, as I'd intended. Leaning forward, I laid it all out for her in brutal clarity. The fraud charges looming over Martin, the asset freezes, the inevitable collapse of his net worth once the divorce was finalized. Do you honestly think a man facing prison time and bankruptcy will have any qualms about leaving you high and dry? I asked with mock sympathy. Or that you'll still hold any appeal to him once the thrill of your tawdry affair fades. Ava's porcelain features crumpled as the truth sank in. She was nothing more than a disposable plaything to Martin, shiny arm candy to be cast aside the moment she ceased to be convenient. You're lying, she whispered. But it was clear she didn't believe her own words. Smiling thinly, I delivered the killing blow. If I were you, I'd get out while you still can. Cut your losses and find yourself a fresh mark to leech off of. plenty of rich, desperate fools out there to exploit. A single tear rolled down Ava's cheek as she stared at me in wordless stupor. I gave her a few moments to absorb the reality crashing down around her before delivering the final twist of the knife. "Oh, and one more thing before you go running back to that pathetic creature you've been betting," I added with sugary venom. "I'd strongly advise emptying out any of Martin's personal accounts or assets you have access to. You'll need whatever you can get to restart your entrepreneurial activities." For just an instant, Ava's mask slipped, and I saw the ruthless mercenary parasite lurking underneath. That was all the confirmation I needed that my carefully planted mole had succeeded in guiding her toward the path of maximum damage. Nodding to herself, Ava stood and wiped away the crocodile tears before squaring her shoulders in false bravado. "You're going to regret this," she spat out in a tremulous voice utterly devoid of conviction. I simply laughed as she turned on her heel and stormed out. The delusional girl had no idea how correct she was, but not for the reason she thought. Once this was all over, the only regret I would feel was not destroying them even sooner. The endgame was finally upon us. Within weeks of Ava's hasty exit, the other shoe dropped with a reverberating thud that shook Martin to his core. I took no small pleasure in being present as the investigator from our corporate security team laid out the damning evidence: bank statements, wire transfers, photos, an entire dossier documenting how Ava had systematically looted over 7 figures from Martin's personal accounts and investment portfolios. She couldn't have," Martin stammered, his face becoming an ashen mask of disbelief. "We were going to start a life together." The investigator simply shrugged, his expression one of practiced neutrality. "I'm afraid the money trail doesn't lie, Mr. Reese. This appears to have been a long-running scheme to bleed you dry." Martin's eyes found mine, pleading for a lifeline amidst the crashing waves of betrayal. "Lillian, you have to believe me. I never thought she was capable of something like this." I crossed my arms, regarding him with a look of utter disdain. "Really, Martin, because it seems to me that poor judgment and self-delusion have become something of a pattern for you lately." His shoulders sagged in defeat as the weight of his situation clearly crushed down upon him. It would have been almost pitiable if he weren't such a despicable creature. "But I don't understand. Why? Why would she do this to me after everything I sacrificed?" He choked out. This time I allowed myself a feral smile. "Isn't it obvious? You were nothing more than a means to an end. A vain, gullible fool ripe for the fleecing by someone younger and prettier who knew just which strings to pull." Martin opened his mouth, no doubt to try and defend his precious Ava's honor, but I silenced him with a raised hand. "Save your breath and what little dignity you have left. This is just the opening act." My smile twisted into something darker. The avalanche was coming, and he was going to lose everything. Over the next several days, the full scope of Martin's ruination began revealing itself. The financial penalties and legal fees started piling up, draining his liquid assets. Forensic auditors identified even more dubious transactions and potential tax avoidance schemes, bringing down the wrath of the IRS. Meanwhile, the revelations of corporate malfeasance I had carefully stoked stripped Martin of every remaining board seat and title position. He went from captaining a billion-dollar empire to a shunned pariah in the span of a month, his legacy crumbling into dust. The killing blow, however, came from an unexpected direction. The gossip rags and society pages that had once fawned over his storybook marriage to me were now tearing him apart. With the collapse of his non-disclosure agreement as part of the divorce proceedings, I carefully fed tantalizing morsels about his affair and accompanying spending benders to key media contacts. Soon tales of poor, used Martin and his gold-digging mistress were splashed across the glossies in salacious detail. A scandal of such delicious karmic proportions was simply too irresistible to avoid, no matter how much old money changed hands to smother it initially. In one final insult, Martin's beloved country club membership was terminated under a cloud of humiliation, the old guard closing ranks around him like a vice. He had become a cautionary tale, something to be shunned and whispered about over chilled Martinez. When he inevitably crawled back to me, begging for clemency and a chance to restore some fragment of his former life, I denied him with icy finality. "This is the bed you made for yourself, Martin," I said, unmoved by his pleas. "I suggest you learn to sleep in it." As he slumped away, broken and discarded, I felt an unfamiliar sensation blossom within me. not quite happiness, but perhaps a sense of resolution. This chapter of betrayal and trauma was finally closed, allowing me to turn my focus to what lay ahead. The machinations had been brutally unpleasant but a necessary crucible to ensure my complete autonomy moving forward. Never again would I allow anyone or anything to compromise the destiny I had fought so hard for. I was Lillian Reese, newly anointed captain of my own fate, and the world had better be ready for my brand of merciless stewardship. As the ashes settled from the scorched battlefield that was my divorce, I wasted no time in firmly establishing my leadership over Reese Industries. The board meetings that had once been merely a formality were now the arenas where I flexed my hard-won power. Profitability is down over 12% compared to last quarter's projections. I stated in a tone that brooked no argument as I stared down the assembled executives. I want to know why, and I want solutions on my desk within 48 hours. There was a momentary silence as the senior leadership team avoided eye contact, each silently willing one of the others to step into the firing line first. Finally, Stephen, the CFO who had been Martin's loyal foot soldier for years, cleared his throat. The shortfalls can likely be attributed to the recent transition and its attending disruptions, he began, choosing his words carefully, not to mention the lingering PR headaches from, My eyes narrowed dangerously. You mean the scandal my dearly departed husband created through his reprehensible behavior, the one that jeopardized this entire company's future through his recklessness. Stephen visibly shrank back, face flushing. Well, I didn't mean to imply. Save it. I cut him off with a withering glare. I don't want to hear any more excuses about factors beyond our control. We make our own destiny here, and anyone unable to adapt to my leadership would be wise to explore other opportunities. The room had gone deathly quiet, the temperature seeming to drop several degrees as the gathered executives finally recognized the new power dynamics at play. This was no longer the Reese Industries of old, where decisions were debated ad nauseam behind closed doors. There would be no more nods to consensus or democratic hand-wringing. My edicts would be final. Mrs. Reese, Maria, the head of operations, ventured after clearing her throat. If I may be so bold, your decisive vision is a marked change from how we've traditionally operated. I think I speak for everyone when I say an adjustment period will be required before we can realign strategy. A few cautious nods rippled through the table, though most seemed to sense the undercurrent of defiance in Maria's words. My jaw clenched hard enough to crack walnuts. Slowly rising to my feet, I fixed Maria with a look that could blister paint. Let me make one thing crystal clear for you and your cohorts, I said, my voice like razors scraping steel. I did not survive decades of being gaslit and undermined by that spineless bastard I called a husband only to face further diminishment from his lackey. Maria shrank back in her seat, all bravado evaporating as I stalked around the table toward her. I could sense the others watching with a mixture of disbelief and morbid fascination. None dared intervene as the new order asserted itself. This company's oligarchic days are over, I stated, leaning in until Maria was forced to maintain eye contact. Either acclimate to my leadership and start pulling your weight, or I'll find those better suited to my vision. Am I making myself clear? She nodded almost imperceptibly, seeming to have momentarily forgotten how to form words. Straightening up, I turned my gaze to encompass the entire cowed assemblage. I did not fight my way through the depths of hell itself just to be undermined again. Reese Industries answers to me now and me alone. My lip curled slightly. And if that reality is too difficult for any of you to accept, I'd be more than happy to expedite your transition into unemployment. The silence that followed spoke volumes. The machine had a new master, and woe betide anyone foolish enough to forget that. As the meeting disbanded, I allowed myself a tight, predatory smile. This was merely an opening gambit, the first assertion of the ruthlessness that would be required to remake this company in my own image. Pity Martin hadn't possessed even a fraction of my strength and resolved those final years he frittered away in pursuit of his youthful indulgences. Perhaps then this bloody transition could have been avoided. But in the end, his failures had become my greatest advantage, the forge where my own ferocious independence was smelted, where I emerged hardened, immutable, and finally in complete control of my destiny. I was Lillian Reese, and from this day forward, my name would be synonymous with strength, perseverance, and remorseless ambition. All that remained was for the rest of the world to take heed.